Hey, looks like the night is dragging on for you too. Happens. When your mind is stuck in that restless space, the hours feel heavier. So let me help lighten it a bit. I'll read you 5 soft stories, gentle enough to fall asleep to, steady enough to keep your thoughts from wandering too far. Story 1. The Neighbor Who Asked Why I Moved Back. I pulled into the driveway 3 days after we buried my mother, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet everything was. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you aware of your own breathing. The house looked smaller than I remembered. 19 years of memories crammed into a 2-story colonial with peeling shutters and a lawn that had gone patchy from neglect. My mother had been in the care facility for almost 2 years by the end, and the house had been sitting here alone, waiting. I guess I had been too. I sat in my car for a long time before going inside. The rain had just started, light, barely more than mist, and I watched it collect on the windshield while I tried to convince myself I was ready for this. I wasn't. But the estate wasn't going to handle itself, and I was the only one left to do it. The key still worked, which surprised me for some reason. Inside, the house smelled exactly the same. Lemon cleaning solution and something floral, maybe lavender, that I'd always associated with my mother. It hit me so hard I had to stop in the doorway and just breathe through it. Everything was where she'd left it. Her reading glasses on the kitchen counter, her favorite mug in the dish rack, dried water spots still visible on the ceramic. A stack of mail on the table that must have been collecting for weeks. I touched the glasses gently, half expecting them to be warm, and then I started crying and couldn't stop for almost an hour. That first night was strange. My old bedroom had been converted into a guest room years ago, but the bones of it were the same. Same window overlooking the backyard, same closet door that never quite latched right. I lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the rain tap against the glass, the radiator clanking to life for the first time in months. The whole house seemed to groan and shift around me, settling into itself like an old dog finding a comfortable position. I told myself the sounds were normal, just a house that had been empty too long, remembering how to be lived in. But I checked the locks twice before I could fall asleep. The next morning was gray and drizzling, the kind of autumn day that feels like it never fully gets light. I'd spent the early hours sorting through papers at the kitchen table, making piles of things to keep and things to throw away, when I realized the recycling was already overflowing. I grabbed a box of old magazines and headed for the bins at the side of the house. That's when I met Mr. Hannigan. I didn't hear him approach. 1 second I was alone. The next he was standing at the fence line between our properties watching me. He was older than I expected a neighbor to be, maybe late 50s, with thinning gray hair and clothes that looked like he'd slept in them. His eyes were pale, watery, fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "Margaret," he said. Not a question, a statement. "I knew you'd come back eventually." I blinked, caught off guard. I hadn't gone by Margaret since middle school. Everyone called me Meg. But he said it like he'd been practicing, like it was a name he'd held in his mouth for years. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" The words came out more defensive than I intended. "Gerald Hannigan. I've lived next door since before you were born." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I watched you grow up in this house." Something about that phrasing made my stomach tighten. Watched you grow up, not saw you around or knew your mother. Watched. I forced a polite smile. "Right, of course. I'm just here to handle my mom's estate. Should only be a few weeks." "Is that so?" He tilted his head, studying me. "Are you alone? Is anyone helping you?" "I'm fine, thanks." I started backing toward the house. "So why did you move back?" he asked. "After all this time?" "Like I said, the estate. That's not why." He cut me off, still smiling that empty smile. "You came back because this is where you belong. This is where you've always belonged." I didn't know what to say to that. Something cold crawled down my spine, and I mumbled an excuse about having to make phone calls before retreating inside. The whole way to the door, I felt his eyes on my back. When I finally looked through the kitchen window, he was still standing at the fence, watching the house. Just a lonely old man, I told myself. Probably doesn't have anyone to talk to. Probably harmless. But I made sure the back door was locked, and I stayed away from the windows for the rest of the day. That night, I went down to the basement looking for my mother's insurance documents. She'd always kept important papers in an old filing cabinet near the water heater, and I needed to find her policy information for the lawyer. The basement was exactly as I remembered it. Unfinished concrete, exposed pipes, decades of accumulated boxes stacked along the walls. It smelled like dust and something faintly metallic. I was halfway through the filing cabinet when I found the box. It was tucked behind a stack of folders, small and unmarked, held closed with a rubber band. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all in my mother's handwriting, all addressed but never sent. One envelope had my name on it. The date was 3 years ago, right around when her dementia started getting bad. Her handwriting was shaky, but deliberate, like she'd been fighting to keep control of the pen. I opened it. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you need to know the truth about Gerald Hannigan. I almost put it down right there. My mother's mind had been slipping for years by then. Paranoia, confusion, seeing threats in every shadow. This was probably more of the same, but something made me keep reading. The letter was 4 pages long, written on both sides in my mother's careful script. Some parts were harder to read than others. The handwriting would get shaky, then steady itself, like she kept having to stop and gather her strength. She wrote that Mr. Hannigan had been watching our family since before I was born. At first, it was small things. He'd linger at the fence when my father was mowing the lawn, asking questions that felt just a little too personal. He'd comment on my mother's schedule, her routines, things he shouldn't have noticed. When my father left, I was only 4, I barely remember him, Mr. Hannigan started paying even more attention. He told me once that he was glad your father was gone, my mother wrote. He said the house felt more peaceful now. Just the 2 of us and you, like a family should be. I stopped reading for a moment, my hands trembling. The basement felt colder than it had a minute ago. Rain drummed steadily on the small window near the ceiling, and I suddenly became very aware of how alone I was down here. The letter continued. When I was 7, my mother caught Mr. Hannigan taking photographs over the fence during my birthday party. She confronted him, and he laughed, said he was photographing the birds in our oak tree. She didn't believe him, but what could she do? He hadn't technically done anything wrong. When I was 12, she found him in our backyard at 11 o'clock at night. He said he was checking the property line, that he thought our fence might be encroaching on his land. She called the police, but by the time they arrived, he was back in his own house, and there was nothing they could do about a neighbor standing in a yard. I should have moved us away, she wrote. I should have found a way. But he was always so careful, Margaret. Always just careful enough that no one would believe me. I set the letter down and pressed my palms against my eyes until I saw stars. This was the paranoia talking. This was the same woman who, in her final years, accused the nurses of stealing her jewelry and thought the mailman was a government spy. Her mind had been unraveling for so long that I'd learned to filter everything she said through that lens. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the image of Mr. Hannigan at the fence that morning. The way he'd said my name, the certainty in his voice when he told me I belonged here. I folded the letter, put it back in the box, and told myself I'd deal with it tomorrow. Then I went upstairs, checked every lock in the house, and pushed a chair under my bedroom door before I could fall asleep. The next few days passed in a blur of sorting and packing. I tried to focus on the practical things, contacting the lawyer, scheduling donations, arranging for an estate sale, normal tasks that didn't involve thinking about my mother's letter or the man next door. But I couldn't stop noticing things. On the 3rd day, I was cleaning out my old bedroom when I saw it. A small hole drilled into the corner of the window frame, painted over so many times it was barely visible. I might never have noticed it if the afternoon light hadn't caught the slight depression just right. I pressed my finger against it. It went all the way through. I looked at the angle. The hole faced directly toward Mr. Hannigan's house, specifically toward his upstairs window, the one with the curtains that always seemed to be moving. Old alarm system, I told myself, or maybe a curtain rod bracket. There were 100 explanations. I stuffed a piece of cardboard into the hole anyway and didn't go back into that room until I had to. 2 days later, I was outside raking leaves. It was late afternoon, the sky heavy with the promise of more rain, and I was trying to make the yard look presentable enough that it wouldn't scare off potential buyers. The rake made a rhythmic scraping sound against the grass, almost soothing in its repetition. You always did like being outside. I spun around. Mr. Hannigan was at the fence again, leaning on it with both arms, like he'd been watching me for a while. I hadn't heard him approach. I never heard him approach. "Excuse me?" My voice came out sharper than I intended. "When you were younger." He smiled that empty smile. "You'd spend hours in this yard, reading on that bench under the oak tree, practicing cartwheels in the grass. Do you remember?" I didn't answer. Something about his tone made my skin crawl. "Did you ever reconnect with Derek?" he asked suddenly. My heart stuttered. "What?" "Derek, your boyfriend from high school. He seemed like a nice boy. A little too handsy for my taste, but nice enough." I stared at him. I'd dated Derek Miller for 3 months during junior year. We'd broken up before prom because he wanted to go with someone else. I hadn't thought about him in years. I had never, in my entire life, mentioned Derek to Mr. Hannigan. "You always wore that blue jacket in the winter," he continued, like he was reminiscing about an old friend. "The puffy one with the fur-lined hood. And you spent too much time on the phone in your room. I could see you pacing back and forth, talking for hours. I always wondered who you were talking to." The rake slipped from my fingers. "I have to go inside," I managed. My voice sounded far away, like it belonged to someone else. "Of course," he nodded pleasantly. "You know where to find me, Margaret." I walked back to the house as calmly as I could. The second I was through the door, I locked it and leaned against it, breathing hard. My hands were shaking. Through the kitchen window, I could see him still standing at the fence, watching the house with that patient, empty expression. That night, I called my Aunt Patricia. She was my mother's younger sister, the only family I had left, and I needed someone to tell me I was being crazy. "Did Mom ever say anything to you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "About the neighbor? Mr. Hannigan?" There was a long pause. In the background, I could hear rain against her windows too, hundreds of miles away. "Your mother always said there was something wrong with that man," Aunt Patricia said finally. "She tried to report him a few times, but he never did anything they could arrest him for. He was too careful." My stomach dropped. Why didn't anyone tell me? "She didn't want to scare you, honey. And honestly, I thought she was being paranoid. You know how she got toward the end." Another pause. "But Meg, that's why she was so insistent you go to college out of state. She wanted you as far away from that house as possible." I thought about all those years, my mother pushing me to apply to schools across the country, encouraging me to stay away during summers, never quite letting me come home for more than a few days at a time. I thought she just wanted me to be independent, to have my own life. "Why didn't she just move?" I asked. "She couldn't afford to. The house was paid off, and she had nothing else. And I think..." Aunt Patricia's voice dropped. "I think part of her was afraid of what he'd do if she tried to leave." After I hung up, I sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, listening to the rain and the radiator and the old house settling around me. I told myself I was only here for a few more weeks. I could handle a few more weeks. I installed a chain lock on my bedroom door that night, started sleeping with my phone in my hand, The screen brightness turned all the way up so I could see it the moment I woke. Just in case. A week after I arrived, I went back to the basement. I'd been avoiding it. Every time I thought about going down there, I'd find something else to do. Another closet to clean out, another box of donations to load into my car. But I still hadn't found my mother's life insurance policy, and the lawyer was getting impatient. It was late afternoon, the sky already darkening with another approaching storm. Rain tapped against the windows as I opened the basement door and flicked on the light. The single bare bulb cast long shadows across the concrete floor, and I had to remind myself that I'd been down here 100 times as a kid. There was nothing to be afraid of. I made my way to the filing cabinet, stepping carefully around boxes of Christmas decorations and old furniture my mother had never gotten around to throwing away. The basement smelled stale, like dust and mildew and something else underneath, something faintly metallic that I couldn't quite place. I was pulling folders from the cabinet, flipping through decades of paperwork, when I noticed something odd about the wall behind the water heater. The concrete looked different there, newer somehow, even though everything else in the basement was old. I set the folders down and moved closer, crouching to get a better look. There was a seam in the wall, faint, painted over, but definitely there. A rectangular outline, maybe 3 feet wide and 3 feet tall, like something had been cut out and then filled back in. My heart started beating faster. I pushed aside some boxes that had been stacked in front of it and found that the concrete within the seam wasn't concrete at all. It was plywood, painted gray to match the walls. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to make it look like part of the foundation. My hands were shaking as I pulled at the edge of the plywood. It came away easily, like it had been removed and replaced many times before. Behind it was a hole, a crawl space maybe 3 feet high, reinforced with old wooden boards that disappeared into darkness. The wood was aged and stained, clearly decades old. This wasn't something that had been built recently. I should have stopped. I should have called the police right then, should have gone upstairs and locked every door and waited for someone else to deal with this. But I had to know. After everything, my mother's letters, Mr. Hannigan's knowing smile, the hole in my window, I had to see where it led. I turned on my phone's flashlight and crawled in. The tunnel was longer than I expected, maybe 15 feet, angling slightly downward as it went. The walls were packed dirt, reinforced with wooden planks, and the ceiling was so low I had to keep my head ducked the entire way. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and too loud in the confined space. The smell was worse in here, damp earth and something organic like rotting leaves. The tunnel ended at a concrete wall, his foundation, Mr. Hannigan's house. But there was a hole in it, small, maybe 8 inches across, roughly patched over from his side, with what looked like spray foam and plaster. Light leaked through the cracks, dim, flickering, the pale blue glow of a television. I pressed my ear against the wall and heard it. Muffled voices, a laugh track. He was watching TV, maybe 20 feet away from where I crouched in the dirt. I could also see marks on the concrete around the hole. Scratches, tool marks, places where the hole had been widened and then filled back in over and over again, over what must have been years. He hadn't just been watching from his window. He'd had access to our basement, to our house, for decades. I backed out of that tunnel so fast I scraped my elbows raw on the wooden supports. I was gasping by the time I emerged, my whole body shaking so hard I could barely stand. The basement seemed to spin around me. That's when I noticed the closet. It was in the corner, half hidden behind a stack of boxes. An old storage closet that had been there as long as I could remember. My mother had always told me not to open it, said it was full of cleaning supplies, chemicals, nothing interesting. I'd never questioned it. Now I walked toward it, like I was moving through water. The door was old wood, warped slightly in its frame. There were scratches on the inside. I could see them through the gap between the door and the jamb. Long, thin scratches, like someone had been trapped inside. I opened it, behind stacks of old Christmas decorations and boxes of ornaments. Pushed all the way to the back of the closet, I found them. A scrunchie. purple with white polka dots. I'd lost it when I was 12, cried for days because my best friend had given it to me. A diary, the one with the little lock on it that I'd kept in 8th grade, that I thought I'd misplaced during a move that never happened. A locket, silver, heart-shaped, with a tiny photo of me and my mother inside. She'd given it to me for my 16th birthday. I'd worn it every day until it vanished from my dresser. And photographs, Polaroids, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Me, sleeping, in my bed, in my room, at 8 years old, at 12, at 15, at 17, the photos scattered from my hands. I couldn't hold them. I couldn't breathe. The basement tilted sideways and I grabbed the door frame to keep from falling. He'd been in my room while I slept for years, taking pictures, taking pieces of my life. My mother knew. That's why she sent me away. That's why she never let me come home for long. She couldn't prove it, couldn't stop it, so she did the only thing she could. She got me out. I don't remember climbing the stairs. I don't remember crossing the kitchen. I just remember slamming the basement door and shoving the bookshelf in front of it, my whole body running on pure adrenaline and terror. The bookshelf was old, heavy, but I moved it like it weighed nothing. I grabbed my phone, tried to dial 911. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 attempts. 911, what's your emergency? There's a man, my voice cracked. My neighbor. There's a tunnel. He was in my house. Ma'am, I need you to slow down. What's your address? I gave it to her, I think. The words didn't feel like they were coming from me. Ma'am, are you in danger right now? Is someone in the house with you? That's when I heard the basement door creak. The bookshelf. It wasn't heavy enough. Or there was another way up. I dropped the phone. The 911 operator's voice was still coming through the speaker, tinny and distant, asking if I was okay, asking me to stay on the line. But I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I just stood there, staring at the basement door, watching the bookshelf shudder as something pushed against it from the other side. Then it stopped. Silence. Just the rain against the windows and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I grabbed my phone off the floor and ran for the front door. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, clumsy and uncoordinated, and I stumbled over my own feet twice before I reached the hallway. The front door was right there, 20 feet away. I could make it. I threw the door open. Mr. Hannigan was standing on my porch. He was soaking wet, rain dripping from his thin gray hair, his clothes plastered to his body. But he was smiling. That same empty smile he'd worn at the fence, like we were old friends catching up after years apart. I heard you found my project, he said. His voice was calm, pleasant even. I was wondering when you would. I stumbled backward into the house. He stepped forward, crossing the threshold like he'd done it 1,000 times before. He probably had. Your mother found it too, you know. He tilted his head, studying me with those pale, watery eyes. Years ago, she was snooping around where she shouldn't have been, just like you. But she could never prove anything. And who would believe her? He smiled wider. The crazy old woman with dementia. Stay away from me. The words came out broken, barely a whisper. I've been waiting 6 years for you to come home, Margaret. He took another step. I took another step back. We were dancing, I realized. A horrible, slow dance through my mother's living room. 6 years. Do you know how long that is? How many nights I sat at my window watching this empty house waiting. My back hit the wall. Nowhere else to go. I watched you grow up. His voice dropped to something soft, almost tender. I watched you learn to walk. I watched you ride your first bike. I watched you sleep, Margaret. I know the way you breathe when you're dreaming. I know the way you curl up on your left side. I know you better than anyone in this world. Better than you know yourself. I couldn't breathe. The air had turned to concrete in my lungs. This is where you belong, he said. with me. It's always been you and me, Margaret. Your mother understood that in the end. That's why she stayed. She knew she couldn't keep us apart forever. He reached for me. Something snapped. I don't know where it came from. Some deep, animal part of my brain that had been screaming at me to run since the moment I saw him at that fence. But suddenly I was moving, grabbing the lamp from the side table and swinging it at his head with everything I had. It connected with a crack. He stumbled sideways, more surprised than hurt, and I bolted. Not for the front door. He was too close. I ran for the kitchen, knocking over chairs, slamming into the counter. I could hear him behind me, footsteps, heavy breathing, a grunt of pain or anger. The back door was right there, 10 feet away, 5 feet. I threw it open and ran into the rain. The backyard was dark, the grass slick and treacherous under my feet. I couldn't see where I was going. Didn't matter. I just ran, crashing through the gate at the side of the house, stumbling into the street. Headlights. A car was coming down the road, its windshield wipers beating frantically against the downpour. I ran straight toward it, waving my arms, screaming sounds that weren't words. The car screeched to a stop. A woman, maybe 40, still in her work clothes, stared at me through the windshield with wide, terrified eyes. I yanked open the passenger door and threw myself inside. "Drive," I gasped. "Please, please drive." "What? Who? Please." She must have seen something in my face, because she didn't ask any more questions. She just hit the gas. The car lurched forward, and I twisted around in my seat to look back at the house. Mr. Hannigan was standing in the backyard. He wasn't running, wasn't chasing. He was just standing there in the rain, watching the car drive away. His face was expressionless, patient, like he had all the time in the world, like he knew this wasn't over. "I'm calling 911, the woman said, her voice shaking. She fumbled for her phone with one hand while keeping the other on the wheel. Just breathe, okay? You're safe now. You're safe." I wanted to believe her. I pressed my forehead against the cold window and watched the rain streak past, and I tried to believe her. We stopped at the end of the street. The woman, her name was Diana, I learned later, kept me in her car with the doors locked while we waited for the police. She talked to me in a low, soothing voice, asking simple questions. What was my name? Where I was from, if I was hurt anywhere. I answered as best I could, but my voice sounded hollow, like it was coming from somewhere far away. The sirens came first, red and blue lights cutting through the gray rain, so bright they hurt my eyes. Then the officers, 2 of them, approaching Diana's car with their hands near their belts. I told them everything, about the tunnel, the photographs, Mr. Hannigan on my porch. The words came out jumbled, out of order, but they listened. They wrote things down. They called for backup. More cars arrived, more officers. Yellow tape went up around my mother's house. I watched them through Diana's rain-streaked windshield, these strangers swarming through the place I'd grown up, and I felt like I was watching a movie about someone else's life. Then I saw him, Mr. Hannigan, walking out of his front door with his hands raised. 2 officers approaching him with their weapons drawn. And even from this distance, even through the rain and the chaos, I could see that he was still smiling. He looked directly at Diana's car, directly at me, and he mouthed 2 words. "See you." Then the officers put him in handcuffs and led him away. The police searched both houses for 3 days. In my mother's basement, they documented the tunnel, photographed everything, measured, and mapped it like archaeologists uncovering a tomb. They told me later that it had been there for at least 30 years, since before I was born. He'd started digging it when my parents first moved in, when my mother was pregnant with me. In his house, they found more. The detective who came to take my official statement was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a voice that never rose above a murmur. She told me only what she thought I needed to know. I'm grateful for that. The rest I learned later, in bits and pieces, from news articles I shouldn't have read, and court documents I couldn't stop myself from requesting. There was a room, in his basement, directly below his bedroom. He'd soundproofed it himself, covered the walls with cork and foam. Inside were filing cabinets filled with photographs spanning more than 2 decades. Thousands of them. Me at every age, in every season. In moments I thought were private. Sleeping, changing, reading by the window, crying after my first breakup, dancing alone in my room when I thought no one could see. There were videotapes too. Recordings from cameras I never knew existed, hidden in places I still can't bring myself to think about. Journals filled with his handwriting, dense and obsessive, documenting my routines, my habits, the boys I talked to, the friends who came over. He'd given me a name in those journals, not Margaret, something else, something that made me sick when the detective told me. And there were supplies, in a locked closet in that soundproofed room, things he'd been collecting, things that suggested he wasn't planning to just watch forever. The detective said my mother might have saved my life by sending me away when she did. I think about that a lot. My mother, alone in that house for 6 years, knowing what was next door, knowing what was under her feet. She couldn't afford to move, couldn't prove anything to the police, couldn't make anyone believe her. So she did the only thing she could. She got me out, and she stayed behind to make sure I never came back. She'd lived with that fear every single day, every night, lying in bed, wondering if this was the night he'd come through the basement. Every morning, checking the windows, the doors, the locks she knew wouldn't stop him if he really wanted in. And she never told me. She let me think she was paranoid, let me dismiss her warnings as dementia, because she knew that if I understood the truth, I'd come back to help her. And she couldn't let that happen. She died in that care facility thinking she'd finally kept me safe, thinking I'd never have to know. I wish she'd been right. Aunt Patricia came to stay with me for a few weeks after. She handled the estate sale, the lawyers, all the things I couldn't face. I never went back inside the house, not once. I couldn't even drive down that street without feeling like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I sold the house to a developer who planned to tear it down. I didn't care what he paid. I just needed it gone. Needed to know that the tunnel, the basement, my childhood bedroom with the hole in the window frame, all of it would be reduced to rubble and hauled away in trucks. I moved across the country. Different state, different city, different everything. I found an apartment on the 4th floor of a building with a doorman and security cameras in every hallway. I paid extra for the unit at the end of the hall, the one with no shared walls except the one facing the elevator. I thought distance would help. I thought new surroundings would let me start over, build a life that wasn't shaped by what he'd done. But some things don't go away just because you want them to. I check the locks 3 times before bed, every night, without fail. I check them even when I know I already checked them because knowing isn't the same as being sure. I installed cameras in my apartment, 4 of them, covering every angle, and I watch the feeds on my phone before I fall asleep. I don't sleep well. Most nights I lie awake for hours, listening for sounds that don't belong. Footsteps in the hallway, the soft click of a door handle turning. Sometimes I wake up at 3 a.m., certain I heard breathing that wasn't mine, and I have to turn on every light and search every room before my heart rate comes back down. Therapy helps, a little. My therapist says what I'm experiencing is normal, that hypervigilance is a trauma response, that my brain is trying to protect me by staying alert. She says it will get better with time. I want to believe her. Some days I almost do. Mr. Hannigan is in prison now. He took a plea deal to avoid trial, 25 years to life, no possibility of parole for at least 2 decades. The prosecutor said it was a good outcome, said I was lucky. I don't feel lucky. I still have my mother's letter, the one she wrote 3 years before she died, trying to warn me about the man next door. I keep it in my nightstand, and sometimes, on the bad nights, I take it out and read it again. Her shaky handwriting, her desperate need to protect me, even when her mind was failing. The last line always makes me cry. I'm sorry I couldn't stop him. I'm sorry I couldn't give you a normal life. But I hope you understand now why I always told you not to come back. I understand, Mom. I finally understand. And I'm not going back. Not to that house. not to that street, not to the girl I was before I knew what was living next door. That version of me is gone. She died in that basement, surrounded by photographs of herself she never knew existed. But I'm still here, damaged, yes, afraid, yes, but alive. So, Mr. Hannigan, Gerald, wherever they're keeping you, I hope you know something. I hope you know that I'm never coming back. Not to that place, not to you, not to the version of me you built in your head over all those years. I'm not your Margaret anymore. I never was. And if you ever get out, if you ever come looking for me, you should know something else. I'm not a little girl sleeping in her bed, unaware of the monster watching from the dark. I'm awake now. I'm paying attention. And this time, I'll see you coming. Story 2. The doorbell camera showing someone inside. The notification came through at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, right in the middle of my shift. I was in the break room at the hospital, halfway through a granola bar and trying to stay awake after 12 hours on my feet when my phone buzzed with that familiar chime. The app I'd installed for the doorbell camera, one of those motion-activated ones everyone has now, lit up with an alert. Motion detected at front door. I almost ignored it. I got these notifications constantly. Squirrels on the porch, delivery drivers dropping packages, the wind blowing leaves across the sensor. Most of the time I'd glance at them, see nothing interesting, and swipe them away without a second thought. But something made me tap this one anyway. Maybe boredom, maybe instinct. I still don't know. The feed loaded, grainy and slightly delayed the way it always was on the hospital's Wi-Fi, and for a second I didn't understand what I was seeing. The camera faced outward toward the street, but you could see a reflection in the glass of the storm door. My living room, reversed and distorted, but still recognizable. And in that reflection, clear as day, someone was walking through my house. I sat up so fast I knocked my coffee off the table. The figure was blurry, warped by the curve of the glass, but unmistakably human. Tall, moving slowly from the direction of the kitchen toward the hallway that led to my bedroom. They paused for a moment, and I could have sworn they turned toward the door, toward the camera, before stepping out of frame. My heart was slamming against my ribs as I rewound the clip and watched it again. And again. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was inside my house. I called 911 with shaking hands, trying to explain to the dispatcher what I'd seen. She was calm, professional, asked me if I was sure it wasn't a family member or roommate, and I told her I lived alone, that no one had a key except me. She said officers would be dispatched, and they'd call me back once they'd cleared the property, and I thanked her even though my voice didn't sound like my own. The next hour was the longest of my life. I couldn't leave work. I was the only nurse on shift until 3, and we had 2 critical patients in the unit who needed constant monitoring. So I sat there in the break room with cold coffee soaking into my scrubs, watching the camera feed on my phone, waiting for the police to arrive, waiting for the figure to reappear. It didn't. By the time the officers called me back, they'd already been through the whole house. Nothing missing, they said. No signs of forced entry. All the doors and windows were locked from the inside, and they'd checked the basement, the attic, every closet. Empty. "You sure about what you saw?" one of them asked, and I could hear the skepticism in his voice, that particular tone people use when they think you're wasting their time. Sometimes these cameras pick up weird reflections. Light plays tricks, especially through glass. I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him I knew what I saw, but I was exhausted and scared, and maybe there was a part of me that wanted to believe him. The part that wanted this to be a glitch, a shadow, something explainable that I could laugh about later. "Yeah," I said, "maybe you're right." But I didn't believe it. I left work as soon as my shift ended and drove home 20 miles over the speed limit, pulling into my driveway with my heart lodged somewhere in my throat. The house looked exactly the same as it had that morning, small, quiet, the porch light on its timer just starting to glow in the early winter darkness. Nothing out of place. I sat in my car for 10 minutes anyway, watching the windows for any sign of movement, before I could make myself go inside. Everything was normal. The kitchen was clean, the dishes I'd left in the sink still sitting there waiting to be washed, the coffee maker exactly where I'd left it on the counter. The living room looked untouched. Same throw blanket draped over the arm of the couch, same stack of mail on the coffee table that I kept meaning to sort through. I walked through every room, flipping on lights, checking behind doors, opening closets I hadn't touched in months. Nothing. The police were right. It must have been a glitch, a reflection of a tree branch, or a shadow from a passing car, or some trick of the camera's motion sensor that my sleep-deprived brain had turned into something sinister. I'd been working too many double shifts, sleeping too little, running on caffeine and adrenaline for weeks. My brain was tired enough to see threats that weren't there. I made myself dinner, watched an episode of something I can't remember now, and went to bed early, telling myself I'd feel better in the morning. But I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up every hour or so, lying in the dark and listening to the house settle around me, the creak of old floorboards contracting in the cold, the hum of the refrigerator cycling on, the distant rattle of the heating vent kicking in. Normal sounds. Sounds I'd heard 1,000 times since I'd moved in 8 months ago. But that night, they didn't feel normal anymore. Every noise made me hold my breath, straining to hear if it was followed by something else. A footstep, a door, the soft exhale of someone trying to stay quiet. In the morning, I went through my routine on autopilot. Shower, coffee, check my phone for messages. I had the next 2 days off, a rare break after a brutal stretch of 12-hour shifts, and I'd been planning to catch up on sleep, maybe finally unpack some of the boxes still stacked in the spare bedroom. I was pouring my second cup of coffee, staring out at the gray November sky, when I noticed it. The kitchen window, the one above the sink, looking out into the backyard. I always kept it locked, always. I'd grown up in a house where my mother checked every window before bed like a ritual, and the habit had stuck with me into adulthood. But that morning, the latch was turned. Not open, just unlocked. The little metal lever rotated 90 degrees from where it should have been. The kind of thing you'd never notice unless you were looking. I stared at it for a long time, my coffee growing cold in my hands. I'd checked that window last night. I was sure of it. Almost sure. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I must have forgotten, that I was more tired than I realized, and my memory was playing tricks on me. I reached over and clicked the latch back into place, and the sound it made, that small, definitive click, seemed to echo through the whole quiet kitchen. It's just a window latch, I told myself. You're losing your mind over a window latch. But even as I thought it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that somewhere in my house, in some corner I hadn't thought to check, someone was listening and waiting. I spent that first day off trying to convince myself everything was fine. I unpacked a few boxes, did some laundry, kept myself busy with the kind of mindless tasks that don't require much thought. The house was quiet around me, just the occasional gust of wind against the siding, the hum of the dryer in the basement, the familiar creak of the old floors under my feet. Normal sounds, safe sounds. By the time evening came, I'd almost managed to talk myself down from the panic of the night before. Then I checked the doorbell camera footage. I don't know why I did it. Morbid curiosity, maybe, or some part of me that needed to prove I'd imagined the whole thing. I sat down at my laptop with a glass of wine and pulled up the app's history, scrolling back through the last week of recordings. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Me leaving for work, me coming home, the occasional delivery driver or neighbor walking past. Nothing unusual. But then I got to the footage from 3 nights ago, and my wine glass stopped halfway to my mouth. The timestamp said 3:14 a.m. The motion sensor had triggered, recording a 12-second clip of my front porch in grainy night vision. At first, I thought it was empty, just the usual view of my doormat and the railing and the street beyond. But then I saw movement in the corner of the frame, and I realized someone was standing just outside the camera's range, their shadow stretching across the porch boards like a stain. The shadow didn't move for the entire 12 seconds. Then the clip ended. I scrolled back further, my hands trembling slightly on the keyboard. 2 nights before that, another 3 a.m. clip, another shadow at the edge of the frame. This time it moved, just barely, a slight shift that might have been someone adjusting their weight. And 3 nights before that, a clip at 2:47 a.m. where the shadow was closer, longer, like whoever was casting it had stepped up onto the porch itself. Someone had been coming to my house in the middle of the night, for over a week, standing on my porch in the dark, just outside the camera's view, watching. I slammed the laptop shut and sat there in the sudden silence, my heart pounding so loud I could feel it in my temples. The wine glass was shaking in my hand, and I set it down before I spilled it everywhere. Outside, the wind had picked up, and I could hear rain starting to patter against the windows, soft at first, then harder, building into a steady drumming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I told myself it could be anyone. A drunk neighbor who got confused about which house was his. Kids playing some stupid prank. A homeless person looking for a dry place to stand during the rain. There were explanations, reasonable explanations, and I just needed to calm down and think clearly. But then, I remembered the window latch and the figure in the reflection, and suddenly, reasonable explanations felt very far away. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light on, my phone in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other, watching the doorbell camera feed in real time on my laptop. The rain kept falling, heavy and relentless, and every time the wind gusted hard enough to shake the trees, I flinched. Nothing happened. No shadows appeared on the porch. No figures walked through my living room. By the time the sky started to lighten around 6, I felt ridiculous, exhausted and paranoid, and probably a little unhinged. I made coffee and tried to eat some toast, but my stomach was too knotted to keep anything down. The rain had tapered off to a drizzle, gray light filtering through the kitchen windows, and I stood at the sink washing my untouched plate when I noticed something else. The basement door was open. Not all the way, just an inch or two, a thin, dark line between the door and the frame. But I always kept that door closed. Always. The basement creeped me out, if I'm being honest. It was old and damp and smelled like dirt and something faintly chemical, and I only went down there to do laundry. I'd certainly never leave the door standing open overnight, letting that cold, musty air seep into the rest of the house. I stood there staring at it for a long moment, the plate forgotten in my hands, water from the faucet running over my fingers. Maybe I'd left it open yesterday when I did laundry. Maybe I'd been so distracted by everything else that I just forgot to close it all the way. That was possible, right? That was a thing that could happen. I set the plate down, dried my hands on my jeans, and walked slowly toward the basement door. The closer I got, the more I could feel that cold air coming up from below, damp and stale, and there was a smell underneath it that I didn't recognize, something organic, something that didn't belong. I pushed the door open wider, and the hinges groaned loud enough to make me jump. The stairs descended into darkness. The light switch was at the bottom, an annoying quirk of the house's old wiring that I'd never gotten around to fixing. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it down into the shadows. The beam illuminated the wooden steps, the concrete floor at the bottom, the cluttered shelves along the far wall where the previous owner had left paint cans and old tools. Everything looked normal. Everything looked exactly the way it had the last time I'd been down there, except for the blanket. It was crumpled in the corner behind the water heater, a dark shape I almost didn't notice against the gray concrete. A blanket, not one of mine, I'd never seen it before, wadded up like someone had been using it as a pillow or a bed. And next to it, catching the light from my phone, were wrappers, food wrappers, a granola bar, a bag of chips, an empty water bottle. Someone had been living in my basement. I don't remember climbing the stairs. I don't remember slamming the basement door and shoving a chair under the handle. I just remember standing in my kitchen, gasping for breath, my whole body shaking so hard, my teeth were chattering. The rain had started up again outside, drumming against the roof, and all I could think was, they were here, while I slept. while I ate dinner and watched TV and went about my normal life. They were right below me, in the dark, listening to every sound I made. And the police had searched the basement. They'd told me they checked everywhere, which meant either they'd missed it or whoever was down there had hidden well enough that trained officers couldn't find them. I didn't know which possibility was worse. I called 911 again, and this time I didn't let them dismiss me. The same skeptical officer from before showed up with his partner, and I could see the look they exchanged when they pulled into my driveway. That "here we go again" expression that made me want to scream. But I didn't care what they thought anymore. I showed them the basement, the blanket, the food wrappers. I showed them the camera footage with the shadows on my porch. I made them look at the window latch and explained, probably too frantically, that I always kept it locked, that someone had been inside, that someone had been living under my feet while I slept. They took it more seriously this time. They had to. The evidence was right there, impossible to explain away as a trick of the light. They searched the basement again, really searched it, moving boxes and checking behind the water heater in the furnace. They found a crawl space I didn't even know existed. A small access panel hidden behind a shelf of old paint cans that led to a dirt-floored area under the front porch. It was empty when they checked, but there were marks in the dirt, footprints, handprints, signs that someone had been coming and going through there for a while. "Looks like someone's been using this as a squat," one of the officers said, shining his flashlight into the crawl space. His voice was different now, less dismissive, and I could see something in his expression that might have been genuine concern. Could be homeless, could be someone casing the place for a burglary. Either way, you should stay somewhere else tonight. We'll increase patrols in the area. Stay somewhere else. Like it was that simple. Like I could just pack a bag and pretend this wasn't happening. Pretend some stranger hadn't been sleeping in my basement and standing on my porch in the middle of the night and walking through my house while I was at work. I wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him, ask him what I was supposed to do with that information, but I just nodded and thanked him and watched them drive away. I didn't have anywhere else to go. My family was 3 states away, and I'd only lived in this city for 8 months, long enough to know some coworkers, not long enough to have the kind of friends you can call at 10 in the morning and say, "Hey, someone's been living in my basement, can I crash on your couch?" So I did the only thing I could think of. I went to the hardware store and bought new locks for every door, a security bar for the sliding glass door in the back, and 3 more cameras to cover the angles the doorbell couldn't see. It took me most of the day to install everything. By the time I finished, my hands were raw from the screwdriver and my back ached from crouching in awkward positions. But I felt better, safer. The new deadbolts were heavy and solid, the kind you couldn't kick through without serious effort. The cameras covered every entrance, every window, every corner of the yard. If anyone came near my house, I'd know about it. I made dinner, actually ate this time, forcing myself to chew and swallow even though everything tasted like cardboard, and settled onto the couch with my laptop open to the camera feeds. 4 views now instead of 1, arranged in a grid on my screen. Front porch, back door, side yard, driveway. I could see everything. No one was getting in without me knowing. The rain had stopped sometime in the afternoon, and the evening was quiet, just the drip of water from the gutters and the occasional car passing on the street. I watched the feeds until my eyes burned, flipping between cameras, zooming in on shadows that turned out to be nothing. By midnight, I was exhausted, but too wired to sleep. I made more coffee, paced the living room, checked the locks for the 5th or 6th time. That's when I decided to check the attic. I don't know why I hadn't thought of it before. The police had said they checked it that first day, but they'd also said they checked the basement, and look how that turned out. The attic access was in the ceiling of my bedroom closet, a pull-down ladder I'd never used, leading to a space I'd never explored. The previous owner had left some boxes up there, according to the realtor, but I'd never bothered to look through them. I stood in my closet, staring up at that access panel, and felt my stomach twist into a knot. I didn't want to go up there. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave it alone, to wait until morning, to call someone and make them do it instead. But I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep until I checked, and I knew that if I waited, the fear would only get worse. I pulled the cord, and the ladder unfolded with a screech of rusty hinges that made me flinch. Dust rained down, tickling my nose, and I had to stifle a sneeze. The darkness above was absolute, a black rectangle cut into my ceiling, and I stood there for a long moment, just listening. Silence. Just the settling of the house and my own ragged breathing. I climbed the ladder with my phone flashlight in one hand, my other hand gripping the rungs so tight my knuckles ached. The attic air was cold and stale, heavy with the smell of dust and old insulation. My flashlight beam swept across cardboard boxes, a broken chair, a rolled-up rug that might have been there for decades. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. Then the light caught something on the far wall, and I felt my heart stop. Photographs, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, taped to the exposed wooden beams in overlapping layers. And every single one was of me. Me coming home from work. Me taking out the trash. Me standing at the kitchen window doing dishes. Me asleep in my bed, the covers pulled up to my chin, my face slack and vulnerable in a way that made me want to vomit. They'd been taken through windows, through gaps in curtains, angles I didn't even know were possible. Some of them were close, so close I could see the pores on my skin, the individual hairs on my arm. Whoever took these had been inches away from me, close enough to touch. I scrambled backwards so fast I nearly fell through the attic opening. My foot slipped on the ladder, and I half climbed, half fell back into my closet, landing hard on my hip and not even feeling the pain. I was making sounds, whimpering, gasping, something between a scream and a sob, and I couldn't stop. I crawled out of the closet on my hands and knees, my vision blurring with tears. And that's when I heard it. A creak from above me, from the attic I'd just left. Someone was still up there. I don't remember making the decision to run. 1 second, I was on the floor of my bedroom, paralyzed with terror, and the next, I was on my feet and sprinting down the hallway toward the front door. Behind me, I heard the attic ladder groan, the sound of weight on those rusty hinges, someone climbing down, and that sound cut through whatever was left of my rational mind like a knife. I hit the living room at a dead run, my socks sliding on the hardwood, and I grabbed for the front door handle with both hands. The new deadbolt, the one I'd spent an hour installing that afternoon, stuck for a heart-stopping second before turning, and then I was outside, stumbling across the porch into the cold night air. I didn't have my keys, didn't have my phone, didn't have shoes. I just ran. My neighbor's house was maybe 50 feet away, a 2-story colonial with a light on in the living room window. I'd never met them, just exchanged waves a few times when we happened to be getting our mail at the same time, but none of that mattered now. I sprinted across my lawn, across their lawn, and pounded on their door with both fists, screaming for help in a voice I barely recognized as my own. The porch light came on, the door opened, and an older man in a bathrobe stood there staring at me like I'd lost my mind. Behind him, I could see a woman peering out from the hallway, her hand pressed to her mouth. I must have looked insane, barefoot, sobbing, gasping for breath, but I didn't care. I pushed past him into their house and slammed the door shut behind me, twisting the deadbolt with shaking hands. "Call 911, I managed to get out between gasps. "There's someone in my house, please, please call 911. The man, his name was Howard, I learned later, didn't ask questions. He just picked up his phone and dialed while his wife guided me to a chair in their kitchen and pressed a glass of water into my trembling hands. I couldn't drink it. I couldn't do anything except sit there and shake, staring at their back door like I expected it to burst open at any second. The police came faster this time, maybe 5 minutes, though it felt like an hour. 3 cars, lights flashing, officers approaching my house with their hands on their weapons. Howard's wife had given me a blanket at some point, and I sat wrapped in it on their front porch, watching the scene unfold like it was happening to someone else. I saw flashlights moving through my windows. I heard shouting, muffled by distance, and the blood pounding in my ears. And then, after what felt like an eternity, one of the officers walked back across the lawn toward me. "House is clear," he said, and something in his voice made my stomach clench. "But you need to come see this. We found something." I didn't want to go back inside. Every cell in my body was screaming at me to refuse, to get in my car and drive and never look back. But I followed him anyway, my bare feet numb on the cold pavement, because I needed to understand. I needed to know who had been living in my walls, watching me sleep, filling my attic with photographs of my life. The bedroom looked the same as I'd left it, closet door hanging open, attic ladder still extended, a rectangle of darkness above. But there was something on my bed now, something that hadn't been there when I ran. A single photograph, placed carefully on my pillow like a love letter or a threat. It was a picture of me from earlier that night, sitting on my couch with my laptop open, the camera feeds glowing on the screen. Taken from inside the house, taken from somewhere behind me in the shadowed corner of the living room where I'd never thought to check. I was looking at the screen, completely unaware, and in the background of the photo I could see a shape, a blur of darkness that might have been a person standing just out of the light, watching me watch for them. "There's more," the officer said quietly. He was holding something in a plastic evidence bag, and when he turned it toward me, I felt the room tilt sideways. It was a key, a copy of my house key attached to a small metal ring with a tag that had been labeled in neat, careful handwriting. The tag said, "Home." They found the rest of it in the crawl space under the porch, a sleeping bag, a small battery-powered lantern, notebooks filled with details about my schedule, when I left for work, when I came home, how long I showered, what I ate for dinner. There were more photographs down there too, hundreds of them, organized by date and time like a meticulous archive. The oldest ones were from 7 months ago, just a few weeks after I'd moved in. He'd been watching me almost from the beginning, but they didn't find him. By the time the police arrived, he was gone, slipped out through some exit I didn't know about, vanished into the night like he'd never been there at all. They searched the neighborhood for hours, brought in dogs, knocked on every door within a 6-block radius. Nothing. I sat in the back of a police cruiser with the blanket still wrapped around my shoulders, watching officers come and go from my house, and tried to process what the detective was telling me. They'd run the fingerprints from the attic and matched them to a man who'd been released from a psychiatric facility 18 months ago. He had a history of what they called fixation behaviors, stalking, breaking and entering, building shrines to women he'd never spoken to. He'd done time for it before, served 5 years, been declared rehabilitated by doctors who never had to live with the consequences. His name was David Allen Mercer. He was 43 years old. And based on the contents of those notebooks, he believed with absolute certainty that we were in love. "We'll find him," the detective said. She sounded like she meant it. "He can't have gone far. We'll have units watching the house, patrols in the area. You'll be safe." I nodded, but I didn't believe her. I'd felt safe before. I'd installed locks and cameras and done everything right, and none of it had mattered. He'd been inside the whole time, watching me try to keep him out, and he'd probably found it funny. I never spent another night in that house. Howard and his wife, Linda, her name was, let me sleep on their couch for the next 3 days while I figured out what to do. They were kind about it, kinder than they had any reason to be, bringing me tea and asking if I needed anything and pretending not to notice when I woke up screaming at 2 in the morning. I don't know what I would have done without them. Probably checked into a motel and sat awake all night with my back against the door, watching the shadows for movement. The police kept me updated, though the updates were never what I wanted to hear. David Allen Mercer had vanished completely. They'd found his car abandoned at a bus station 2 towns over, but the trail went cold after that. He could be anywhere, they said. He could be in another state by now. They were working with federal authorities, coordinating with other departments, doing everything they could. It wasn't enough. I knew it wasn't enough because I'd read his notebooks by then. The detective had let me see some of the pages, thinking it might help me understand, and I wished she hadn't. The things he'd written about me, the plans he'd made, The future he'd imagined for us in that cramped, obsessive handwriting. It made me understand that this wasn't going to end just because the police were looking for him. He'd waited 18 months after getting out of that facility before finding someone new to fixate on. He was patient. He knew how to disappear. I quit my job at the hospital, packed what I could fit into my car, and left the rest for the estate sale company to deal with. I didn't even go back inside to get my things. I had a friend from work do it for me, walking through the rooms with her phone on video so I could point to what I needed. Every time the camera panned past a window or a closet or that hallway leading to the bedroom, I felt my chest tighten until I couldn't breathe. I moved across the country to a city where I didn't know anyone, which felt safer than staying somewhere he might look for me. I found an apartment in a high-rise with a doorman and a security desk and cameras in every hallway, and I paid 3 months' rent up front because I needed to know I had somewhere to hide. The building had 22 floors, and I chose a unit on the 19th because it felt far enough from the ground that no one could reach me. It's been almost a year now since that night. I have a new job at a different hospital, new co-workers who don't know anything about what happened, a new routine that feels almost normal sometimes. I've been seeing a therapist who specializes in trauma, and she says I'm making progress. She says the hypervigilance will fade eventually, that my nervous system just needs time to understand that the danger has passed. But I'm not sure the danger has passed. That's the thing no one seems to understand. David Allen Mercer was never caught. 6 months after I left, the detective called to tell me they'd closed the active investigation, not because they'd found him, but because they'd run out of leads. He was still out there somewhere, living his life, and I had no way of knowing if he'd moved on to someone else or if he was still thinking about me, still planning, still waiting. I checked the locks on my apartment door 4 times before bed. I've installed cameras in every room, even the bathroom, because I need to be able to see every corner of my space at all times. I don't sleep well. Most nights I lie awake for hours, listening to the building settle around me, flinching at every creak and groan. When I do sleep, I dream about that attic, about those photographs covering the walls, about the blur in the background of that picture on my pillow. Sometimes I dream that I'm back in the house and I can hear him moving around downstairs, opening cabinets, running water in the sink, making himself at home. I wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, and I have to turn on every light and check every room before my heart rate comes back down. My therapist says this is normal. She says it takes time to feel safe again after something like this. But I don't think I'll ever feel safe, not really. Not the way I did before, when I could come home from work and make dinner and fall asleep without wondering if someone was watching me through a gap in the curtains. That version of me is gone. She died in that attic, surrounded by photographs of herself she never knew existed, and whoever I am now is someone different, someone harder, someone who knows that locks can be picked and cameras can be fooled, and the monsters don't always look like monsters. Last week, I got a notification from the doorbell camera at my old house. The new owners must not have reset it from my account because it still sends me alerts sometimes. Motion detected, usually just their kids playing in the yard or a delivery driver dropping off packages. I know I should delete the app, disconnect from that place completely, but some part of me can't let go. Some part of me needs to keep watching, just in case. The notification came through at 3:14 a.m. I almost didn't check it. I was half asleep, my phone glowing on the nightstand, and I told myself it was nothing, just a raccoon or a stray cat or the wind. But I checked anyway. I had to. The footage showed the front porch, empty and dark, the motion sensor triggered by something just outside the frame, and there, stretching across the porch boards like a stain, was a shadow. Long, still, familiar. It stood there for 12 seconds. Then the clip ended. I don't know if it was him. I don't know if he's still watching that house, waiting for me to come back, or if he's already found the new owners and started the whole cycle again. I don't know if he's tracked me down to my new city, my new apartment, my new life that I've tried so hard to build from the ashes of the old one. But I know this. I check the cameras every night now, every angle, every corner, every shadow that moves. And I sleep with a knife under my pillow and my phone in my hand. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that safety is an illusion. The locks only keep out the people who weren't determined to get in anyway. And some people are very, very determined. So David, if you're out there, if you're reading this somehow, I want you to know something. I'm not the same person I was when you found me. I'm not naive anymore. I'm not trusting. I don't leave windows unlocked or assume the sounds in my house are just the building settling. I'm watching now too, and if you ever come for me again, I'll be ready. Story 3, The Jogger Who Paused When I Turned Around. I started running about 6 months after my divorce was finalized, partly because my therapist suggested it, and partly because I needed something to do with all the restless energy that had taken up residence in my chest. I'd never been athletic, spent most of my 20s behind a desk, convincing myself that walking to the coffee machine counted as exercise. But something about those early morning miles through my new neighborhood made me feel like I was reclaiming a part of myself I'd lost somewhere along the way. By the time I noticed the man following me, running had become the best part of my day. The trail I used cut through a green belt about half a mile from my apartment complex, winding along a creek bed before looping back through a small wooded area and spitting you out near the elementary school on Maple Street. It was popular with dog walkers and other joggers during peak hours, but I preferred going early, 6 in the morning, when the sky was just starting to lighten and the trail was mostly empty. I liked the quiet. I liked the way the mist hung over the water and the sound of my own footsteps on the packed dirt. It felt meditative, almost sacred, those 45 minutes before the rest of the world woke up. I first noticed him on a Tuesday in late September, about 3 weeks before everything fell apart. The morning was cool but not cold, the kind of perfect autumn weather that makes you grateful to be alive and moving. I was halfway through my usual loop, approaching the wooden footbridge that crossed the creek, when I got that prickly feeling on the back of my neck, the one that tells you someone's watching, even when you can't see them. I glanced over my shoulder without breaking stride, expecting to see a dog walker or maybe another early riser like me. Instead, I saw a man about 50 yards back, jogging at roughly my pace. He was wearing dark, athletic clothes, black shorts, gray hoodie with the hood up, and something about his posture made me uneasy. Not the way he was running exactly, but the way he seemed to be maintaining that exact distance. Not gaining on me, not falling behind, just keeping pace. I turned back around and told myself I was being paranoid. The trail was public. People used it all the time. There was nothing unusual about another jogger being out here at the same hour, following the same route. I picked up my pace slightly, focusing on my breathing, trying to shake off the weird feeling that had settled between my shoulder blades. A few minutes later, I looked back again. He was still there, same distance, same pace, and this time, when I turned to look at him, he stopped, not slowed down, stopped completely, like someone had pressed pause on a video. He stood there motionless in the middle of the trail, and even from 50 yards away, I could feel him watching me. I couldn't see his face clearly under the hood, couldn't make out any features, but I knew he was looking right at me. I snapped my head forward and kept running, my heart suddenly pounding harder than the exercise warranted. Behind me, I heard his footsteps resume, that steady slap of sneakers on dirt, and I didn't look back again until I reached the trailhead near the elementary school. By then, he was gone. The trail behind me was empty, just morning mist and the distant sound of traffic starting to build on the main road. I stood there for a long moment, hands on my knees catching my breath. My skin was clammy with more than just sweat, and I couldn't shake the image of him standing there, frozen mid-stride, staring at me like he'd been waiting for me to notice. But the more I thought about it, the more ridiculous it seemed. He probably just stopped to check his phone, or tie his shoe, or catch his breath. The timing was coincidental. I was letting my imagination run wild because I'd been watching too many true crime documentaries and spending too much time on Reddit threads about women who disappeared while jogging alone. I walked back to my apartment instead of finishing the loop, telling myself it was because I'd pushed too hard and my calves were sore. I made coffee, showered, sat down at my laptop to start work. By noon, I'd almost convinced myself the whole thing had been nothing. Then the next morning, I saw him again. Same spot on the trail, same dark clothes, same 50-yard distance that never seemed to change no matter how fast or slow I went. I tested it this time, deliberately varying my pace, speeding up for 100 yards, then slowing to almost a walk. He matched me perfectly, like we were connected by an invisible tether, and when I finally worked up the courage to turn around and look directly at him, he stopped again, just stopped, standing there in the middle of the trail with his hands at his sides, watching me from under that hood. This time I didn't keep running. I stopped too, turning fully to face him, and for a long, horrible moment, we just stood there staring at each other across that stretch of packed dirt. I could hear birds singing in the trees, the distant rush of water in the creek, my own breath coming fast and shallow. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't call out, didn't do any of the things a normal person would do when they realized they'd accidentally been matching someone's pace. He just stood there. Then a dog walker appeared around the bend behind him, an older woman with a golden retriever, and it was like a spell breaking. He started running again, veering off onto a side trail I hadn't even noticed before, and within seconds he was gone, swallowed by the trees like he'd never been there at all. The dog walker passed me with a cheerful, "Good morning," and I managed to nod back, my legs shaking so badly I wasn't sure I could keep standing. I waited until she was out of sight, then I walked home as fast as I could without actually running. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole way, but the trail behind me stayed empty. That night, I looked up statistics about women being attacked while jogging. The numbers were worse than I'd expected. One study said nearly half of all female runners had experienced some form of harassment, and another said attacks were most common on secluded trails during early morning or evening hours. I read about a woman in Massachusetts who'd been followed for weeks before her attacker finally made his move. I read about another in Colorado whose body was found half a mile from the trailhead where she always parked her car. I told myself I was being dramatic, that plenty of women ran alone every day without anything happening to them, that the man on the trail was probably just some socially awkward guy who didn't realize how creepy he was being, but I set my alarm for 30 minutes later the next morning, figuring I'd change up my routine and throw off whatever weird pattern I'd accidentally established. I'd go at 6:30 instead of 6. I'd take a different route, maybe loop through the neighborhood streets instead of the greenbelt. Everything would be fine. Except when I stepped outside at 6:30, he was already there, standing at the edge of the parking lot, wearing the same dark clothes, the same hood pulled up over his face, just standing, waiting, like he knew exactly what time I'd come out. I went back inside so fast I nearly tripped over my own doormat. My hands were shaking as I twisted the deadbolt, and I stood there with my back pressed against the door, breathing hard, trying to convince myself that what I'd just seen wasn't real. Maybe it was a different person. Maybe it was a coincidence. Some early riser from my building heading out for his own workout, completely unrelated to the man on the trail. The parking lot was shared by 3 apartment buildings. There were probably dozens of people who used it at that hour, but I knew it was him. Even without seeing his face clearly, I recognized the posture, the stillness, the way he stood with his weight evenly distributed, like he was prepared to wait there all day. I'd only seen him twice before, but something about his presence had burned itself into my memory, a silhouette I'd recognize anywhere, in any context. And he'd been watching my building, watching my door. I didn't run that day. I called in sick to work and spent the morning pacing my apartment, peeking through the blinds every few minutes to see if he was still there. He wasn't. The parking lot was empty by 7, just rows of cars gleaming under the pale morning sun. But that almost made it worse. If he'd stayed, I could have called the police, pointed him out, made someone else see what I was seeing. Instead, he'd vanished again, leaving me with nothing but my own racing thoughts and the growing certainty that I was losing my mind. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he lived in one of the other buildings and I'd just never noticed him before. Maybe he was training for a marathon and happened to use the same trail I did at roughly the same times. Maybe the whole stopping when I looked at him thing was some kind of optical illusion, a trick of distance and early morning light. I'd read somewhere that humans are hardwired to see patterns and threats even when they don't exist, a holdover from our days as prey animals scanning the savannah for predators. That's all this was. My lizard brain misfiring, turning an innocent stranger into a monster. I almost believed it. Then I saw him at the grocery store. It was 3 days later, a Saturday afternoon. I'd forced myself to resume some semblance of normal life, which meant finally restocking my fridge after a week of surviving on delivery apps and whatever was left in my freezer. The store was crowded, families with shopping carts, teenagers blocking the aisles, the usual weekend chaos, and I'd relaxed a little in the noise and bustle of it. Hard to feel watched when you're surrounded by 100 other people arguing about cereal brands and produce prices. I was in the dairy section, comparing yogurt labels, when I felt that familiar prickle on the back of my neck. That weight of someone's attention, pressing against my skin like a physical force. I looked up, already knowing what I'd see, and there he was. Standing at the end of the aisle, maybe 30 feet away, holding a basket and wearing normal clothes this time. Jeans, a plain blue t-shirt, but unmistakably him. Same height, same build, same unsettling stillness. He was looking directly at me, not pretending to shop, not glancing casually in my direction, just staring, his face blank and expressionless, like I was something he was studying. I abandoned my cart and walked out of the store as quickly as I could without actually running. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely get my car door open, and I sat in the driver's seat for 10 minutes before I trusted myself to drive home. He didn't follow me out of the store, at least I didn't see him follow me, but by the time I pulled into my parking lot, I was crying. Big, ugly sobs that I couldn't control, tears streaming down my face as I fumbled with my keys and stumbled into my apartment and locked every lock I had. That night, I called my friend Jessica from college. She was the most practical person I knew, the kind of woman who always had a plan and never seemed rattled by anything, and I needed someone to tell me what to do. I explained everything, the trail, the stopping, the grocery store, and waited for her to say something reassuring. Instead, she was quiet for a long moment. "Have you called the police?" "And told them what?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That a man jogged behind me a few times and I saw him at Kroger. They'd think I was crazy." "You're not crazy," she said firmly. "Trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it's wrong. Can you vary your routine? Shop at different stores, run at a gym instead of outside?" I told her I'd try. We talked for another hour about nothing in particular, and by the time I hung up, I felt marginally better. Jessica was right. I just needed to change my patterns, make myself harder to predict. Whoever this guy was, he clearly knew my schedule. If I stopped being predictable, he'd lose interest and move on to an easier target. So that's what I did. I canceled my morning runs entirely and signed up for a gym across town, one with treadmills and security cameras and other people around at all hours. I started shopping at 3 different grocery stores on rotating days, never the same one twice in a row. I varied my work-from-home schedule, sometimes starting early, sometimes late, so there was no consistent pattern to when I left my apartment or came back. For 2 weeks, it worked. I didn't see him, not on the streets, not at the stores, not lurking in parking lots or standing motionless on jogging trails. The knot in my chest started to loosen. I began to wonder if maybe Jessica was right, if maybe he'd just been some harmless weirdo who'd fixated on me briefly and then moved on when I stopped being available. It happened sometimes, didn't it? Not every creepy encounter had to end in tragedy. Then I found the notes. I'd been doing laundry in the basement of my building, one of those shared facilities with a row of washers and dryers and a bulletin board covered in flyers for dog walkers and furniture sales. I was transferring my clothes from the washer to the dryer when I noticed something tucked into the pocket of my jeans, a small piece of paper folded neatly into a square. I unfolded it with numb fingers, and my stomach dropped through the floor. It was a photograph of me taken through my living room window, sitting on my couch with my laptop. The angle was wrong somehow, too high, like whoever took it had been above me, maybe standing on the small balcony that wrapped around the second floor of my building, the one that was supposed to be accessible only to residents. On the back, written in neat, careful handwriting, were 3 words: I see you. I tore through the rest of my laundry, checking every pocket, every fold. There were 2 more photographs, one of me sleeping, taken through my bedroom window. I could see the gap in my curtains. The narrow strip I'd never noticed wasn't fully closed. The other was of me at the gym, on the treadmill, taken through the glass doors from the parking lot outside. He hadn't lost interest. He hadn't moved on. He'd just gotten closer. I went to the police the next morning with the photographs in a plastic bag, my hands still shaking from a sleepless night spent sitting up in bed with every light on. The officer who took my report was a woman about my age, with kind eyes and a patient manner, and I could tell she was taking me seriously even before I finished explaining. She asked all the right questions. How long had this been going on? Had I noticed anyone new in my building? Did the man on the trail ever speak to me or make threats? And when I handed her the photographs, her expression shifted into something harder, more alert. These were placed in your laundry, she repeated, turning the plastic bag over in her hands. In a shared facility in your building, which means he has access to the building, or he's getting in somehow without being noticed. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I'd already figured that out on my own, lying awake at 3 a.m, staring at the shadows on my ceiling and wondering if he was out there right now, watching my windows from some hidden vantage point. The officer, her name was Rodriguez, I remember because I made myself memorize it, like having her name would somehow keep me safe, explained what they could do. They'd file a report, increase patrols in my area, maybe have someone check the building's security cameras if management would cooperate. But without more evidence, without knowing who this man was, there wasn't much else. He hadn't made any direct threats. He hadn't touched me or damaged my property. In the eyes of the law, taking photographs of someone in public wasn't technically a crime, even if it made my skin crawl to think about it. What about the one through my bedroom window? I asked, my voice cracking. I was sleeping. That's not public. She nodded slowly. That's different. That could be voyeurism, potentially stalking if we can establish a pattern. But we'd need to identify him first, and these photos don't show his face. She paused, and I could see her choosing her next words carefully. Do you have somewhere else you can stay for a while? Family, friends, just until we can look into this further? I thought about my empty apartment, the windows I'd never be able to look at the same way again. I thought about the second-floor balcony, supposedly secured, and how easy it would be for someone determined enough to find a way up. I can stay with a friend, I said, even though I wasn't sure that was true. Jessica lived 4 hours away. My parents were in Florida. I'd moved to this city for a job and a marriage, and now that both were gone, I didn't have much left. That afternoon, I started researching. I'd always been good at finding information. It was part of my job, digging through databases and public records for a legal consulting firm. And now, I turned those skills toward the man who'd been following me. I started with the apartment complex, pulling up the tenant directory, scrolling through names and faces and looking for anyone who matched what little I knew. Tall, dark clothes, that distinctive stillness like a predator waiting to strike. Nothing jumped out. I expanded my search, looking at nearby buildings, checking social media for anyone who'd posted about the Greenbelt Trail or the gym I'd been using. I spent hours down rabbit holes, clicking through profiles and posts and tagged locations until my eyes burned and my head ached. I found plenty of men who ran that trail, plenty who matched the general description, but none of them felt right. None of them made that cold sensation crawl up my spine the way he did. I was about to give up when I found the article. It was from a local news site dated 8 months earlier. A woman named Danielle Vega had reported a stalker to police after weeks of being followed on her morning jogs through a park about 15 miles from where I lived. The article included a sketch based on her description. Tall, average build, always wearing dark athletic clothes with the hood up. He'd followed her for over a month before she finally caught him standing outside her apartment one night. When she screamed, he ran. Police investigated, but never identified him. 3 months later, Danielle Vega moved out of state. The article mentioned it as a footnote, almost an afterthought. She'd relocated for personal reasons. No further updates. I dug deeper and found 2 more. A woman named Michelle Pratt, who'd filed multiple police reports about a man following her during her evening walks, only to have the case go cold when she stopped reporting. The trail ended abruptly, no explanation given. And another, a jogger named Stephanie Walsh, who'd written a long post on a neighborhood Facebook group warning other women about a man she'd encountered on a running trail. The post had dozens of comments, other women chiming in with their own sightings, their own stories of feeling watched. Stephanie hadn't posted anything since. 3 women, 3 different neighborhoods, all within a 20-mile radius. All of them gone now, moved away, stopped posting, vanished from the digital landscape like they'd never existed. And all of them had described the same thing I'd seen, a man who followed at a fixed distance and stopped completely when they turned around. I printed everything out, hands trembling as the pages slid from the printer. This wasn't random. This wasn't some awkward stranger who didn't understand boundaries. This was a pattern, a hunter working his way through the city, picking off women one by one, driving them away, or worse. And I was his latest target. I called Officer Rodriguez and told her what I'd found. She listened, took notes, said she'd look into it, but I could hear something in her voice that sounded like doubt, like she thought I might be connecting dots that didn't really connect. Coincidences happen, her tone seemed to say. Women get scared and move. It doesn't mean they're all running from the same man. I hung up feeling more alone than ever. That night, I packed a bag and drove to a motel 40 minutes outside the city. I paid in cash, gave a fake name, and double-checked the lock on my door before pushing the dresser in front of it. I lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the highway traffic and the rattle of the ancient air conditioner, and tried to convince myself I was safe here, that I'd finally put enough distance between us. Around 2 a.m, my phone buzzed with an email notification. Unknown sender. No subject line. I opened it, knowing I shouldn't, knowing nothing good could come from a message sent at this hour from someone I didn't recognize. It was a photograph of me standing at the motel check-in desk 3 hours earlier, my overnight bag slung over my shoulder. Taken from somewhere in the parking lot, through the glass doors of the lobby. Below it, one line of text. "You can't hide from me." I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of that motel bed with my phone clutched in my hands, staring at the door, waiting for the handle to turn. Every sound made me flinch. Footsteps in the hallway, a car door slamming in the parking lot, the ice machine humming somewhere down the corridor. I called 911 and told them someone was stalking me, that he'd followed me to this motel, that I had proof on my phone. The dispatcher said she'd send a patrol car to check the area, and 20 minutes later I watched through a gap in the curtains as a police cruiser rolled slowly through the parking lot, its spotlight sweeping across the rows of cars. They didn't find anything. They never found anything. By the time the sun came up, I'd made a decision. Running wasn't working. Hiding wasn't working. Changing my routine, switching gyms, driving to motels in the middle of the night. None of it mattered, because he was always one step ahead, always watching, always there. If I couldn't escape him, I'd have to face him. I'd have to make him stop. I checked out of the motel at 7 and drove back to my apartment with a baseball bat I'd bought at a sporting goods store on the way. It felt ridiculous, like something out of a bad movie, but the weight of it in my hands gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in weeks. I wasn't just going to be a victim. I wasn't going to disappear like Danielle and Michelle and Stephanie, erased from the world because some man decided I belonged to him. If he wanted me, he was going to have to work for it. I spent the day preparing. I moved furniture away from the windows so I'd have clear sight lines. I downloaded an app that would automatically upload video to the cloud if I started recording. No more losing evidence if something happened to my phone. I emailed copies of everything I'd found to Jessica, to Officer Rodriguez, to my own backup account, with instructions to release it publicly if anything happened to me. If I was going to confront this, I wanted there to be a trail. I wanted someone to know the truth. That evening, I went for a run. It sounds insane, I know. After everything that had happened, voluntarily putting myself back on that trail was probably the stupidest thing I could have done. But I was tired of being afraid. I was tired of letting him dictate where I could go and when, tired of looking over my shoulder every second of every day. The Greenbelt was public property, and I had just as much right to use it as anyone else. If he showed up, at least this time I'd be ready. The trail was quiet in the fading light, the sun dropping toward the tree line and painting everything in shades of gold and orange. I ran at an easy pace, my phone in an armband, my finger hovering over the record button. The baseball bat was back in my car. I couldn't exactly carry it while jogging, but I had pepper spray clipped to my waistband and a personal alarm that would emit a 120 decibel shriek if I pulled the pin. Not much, but better than nothing. I made it halfway through the loop before I felt him. That prickle on my neck, that weight of attention. I didn't turn around right away this time, just kept running, kept my pace steady, kept my breathing even. I wanted him to think I hadn't noticed. I wanted him to get closer. The footbridge was coming up ahead, the wooden boards spanning the creek where the trail narrowed to a single lane. If he was going to make a move, that's where it would happen. Isolated, confined, no easy escape route. The perfect spot for a predator. No. I stopped in the middle of the bridge and turned around. He was 20 feet away. Closer than he'd ever been before. Close enough that I could finally see his face. Ordinary, almost forgettable, the kind of face you'd pass on the street without a second glance. Brown hair, pale skin, a thin mouth that wasn't quite smiling but wasn't not smiling either. He was wearing the same dark clothes, the same hoodie, but the hood was down now. He wanted me to see him. "Why are you following me?" My voice came out steadier than I expected. I had my hand on the pepper spray, my thumb on the safety. He tilted his head slightly, studying me the way he'd studied me that day in the grocery store. "You know why?" "I don't. I've never seen you before in my life." "That's not true." He took a step closer, and I took a step back, my heel hitting the edge of the bridge. "I've been watching you for a long time. You just didn't notice until now." My stomach lurched. "How long?" "Long enough." Another step. He was maybe 15 feet away now, and the smile that wasn't quite a smile had spread into something wider, something wrong. Long enough to know everything about you. Where you work, where you sleep, what you eat for breakfast. Long enough to know you're lonely, that you cry at night sometimes, that you still keep your wedding ring in a box in your nightstand even though he's gone. I couldn't breathe. The air had turned to glass in my lungs, sharp and brittle. He knew about the ring. He knew about the ring, which meant he'd been inside my apartment, going through my things, touching my belongings while I slept in the next room. "What do you want?" I whispered. He stopped walking. For a long moment, he just looked at me, that awful smile frozen on his face. "I want you to understand," he said softly. "You're not alone anymore. You don't have to be afraid. I'm going to take care of you now." Something snapped inside me. All the fear, all the helplessness, all the weeks of feeling hunted and trapped. It all crystallized into something hot and sharp, something that tasted like rage. I pulled the pin on my personal alarm and threw it at him. The shriek was deafening, a wall of sound that made him stagger backward with his hands over his ears. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I ran, Not away from him, but toward him, closing the distance before he could recover, and I hit him with the pepper spray at point-blank range. He screamed, clawing at his eyes, and I shoved past him with every ounce of strength I had, knocking him off balance, sending him stumbling toward the edge of the bridge. I didn't look back. I just ran, faster than I'd ever run in my life, my lungs burning and my legs pumping, and the sound of his screaming fading behind me. I burst out of the trailhead and into the parking lot where a family was loading their kids into a minivan, and I grabbed the father's arm and gasped out something about a man on the trail. "Call the police. Please call the police right now." They found him 20 minutes later, still on the bridge, still rubbing his eyes and cursing. He didn't try to run. When the officers approached him, he just smiled that wrong smile and said, "She'll come back to me." They always do. His name was Gregory Paul Whitmore. 41 years old, no prior criminal record, worked as an IT technician for a company downtown. On paper, he was nobody, just another anonymous face in the crowd, the kind of person you'd forget 5 seconds after meeting them. But the things they found in his apartment told a different story. The detective who called me 2 days later spoke in that careful, measured tone people use when they're trying not to traumatize you further. She said they'd executed a search warrant and discovered what she called a collection: photographs, journals, personal items that didn't belong to him. Not just mine, either. They'd found belongings from at least 6 different women, some dating back over a decade. Driver's licenses, jewelry, clothing, locks of hair sealed in labeled plastic bags. Trophies, she called them, souvenirs from his conquests. Danielle Vega's name was in those journals. So was Michelle Pratt's. So was Stephanie Walsh's. Page after page of meticulous observations, schedules, habits, every detail of their lives recorded in that same neat handwriting I'd seen on the back of the photographs he left in my laundry. He'd documented everything. When they woke up, when they went to sleep, who they talked to, what they wore. He'd written about the moment each of them finally noticed him, described it like a hunter describing the instant his prey realizes it's being watched. That was the part he liked best, according to the detective. The fear, the recognition, the knowing. The journals also explained what happened to them. Danielle moved to Oregon after he broke into her apartment while she was sleeping and left a rose on her pillow. Michelle stopped reporting to police because he'd sent her photographs of her elderly mother's house, her niece's elementary school, her sister's workplace, a silent threat that needed no words. Stephanie deleted her social media and changed her name after he mailed her a package containing her own underwear, stolen from her laundry weeks earlier. None of them had been physically harmed. That was the part that haunted me most, in a strange way. He hadn't touched any of them, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't want to. Not yet. The chase was the point. The fear was the point. He wanted to stretch it out, savor it, watch them slowly unravel before he finally made his move. And if they ran before he was ready, he just found someone new. I was lucky, the detective said. If I hadn't fought back, if I'd kept running instead of confronting him, he would have escalated eventually. The journals made that clear. He had plans for me, detailed, specific plans that I asked her not to describe, and she respected that. Some things are better left unknown. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Gregory Whitmore was charged with stalking, voyeurism, breaking and entering, and a half-dozen other offenses that added up to serious prison time. The prosecutor told me she was confident he'd be convicted on most counts, that between the physical evidence and the journals, the case was about as solid as these things ever get. I testified at the preliminary hearing, sitting in a witness box 15 feet from the man who'd made my life a nightmare, and I didn't look away when our eyes met. He smiled at me, that same wrong smile, and I smiled back. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who'd survived. He's in prison now, awaiting trial. The prosecutor says it could be another year before the case is fully resolved, but she's confident he won't make bail. Too much evidence, too many victims, too clear a pattern of escalation. For the first time in months, I can walk outside without feeling like someone's watching. I can go for a run without looking over my shoulder every 30 seconds. I can sleep through the night, most nights, without waking up in a cold sweat, convinced there's someone standing in the corner of my room. Most nights, not all of them. I moved out of that apartment complex 2 weeks after his arrest. I couldn't stand being there anymore. Couldn't stop thinking about the balcony he'd climbed to photograph me through my window, the laundry room where he'd touched my clothes, the parking lot where he'd stood watching my door. I found a new place across town, a house this time, small but private, with a fence around the yard and neighbors close enough to hear me if I screamed. I installed cameras, motion sensors, an alarm system that cost more than my first car. I adopted a dog from the shelter, a German Shepherd mix named Bruno, who barks at everything and sleeps at the foot of my bed every night. I still run. That was important to me, reclaiming that piece of my life he'd tried to take away. But I don't run alone anymore. I joined a group that meets 3 times a week at a local park, a dozen women who watch out for each other and never let anyone fall too far behind. We talk about our lives while we run, share stories, complain about our jobs and our families and the weather. It's not the same as those quiet, meditative mornings I used to love, but it's something. It's enough. Jessica flew out to stay with me for a week after everything happened. She held me while I cried, made me eat when I forgot to, sat with me through the long nights when sleep wouldn't come. Before she left, she told me I was the bravest person she knew. I don't feel brave. I feel like someone who got lucky, who happened to snap at the right moment instead of freezing, who threw a personal alarm and sprayed pepper spray and ran like hell because there was nothing else left to do. But maybe that's what bravery is. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it win. I think about the other women sometimes. Danielle in Oregon, Michelle wherever she ended up, Stephanie living under a different name in a different city. I wonder if they've heard about the arrest, if they know the man who terrorized them is finally facing consequences. I hope they're healing. I hope they've found some measure of peace. I hope they're not still looking over their shoulders, still waking up at 2 a.m. with their hearts pounding, still flinching at the sound of footsteps behind them on an empty street. I hope those things for myself, too. Someday. The trial is scheduled for next spring. I'll have to testify again, sit in that courtroom, and describe in detail everything he did to me, everything he planned to do. The prosecutor says it might take days. She says it will be hard, but necessary, that putting him away for as long as possible is the only way to make sure he never does this to anyone else. I'll be there. I'll tell them everything. And when it's over, when they finally lock him up and throw away the key, I'm going to go for a run, alone, at dawn, on that same trail where this whole nightmare started. I'm going to feel the morning mist on my face and listen to the birds singing in the trees and remember what it felt like before I knew monsters were real. And if I feel that prickle on the back of my neck, that weight of someone's attention, I'm going to turn around and look, because I'm not afraid anymore. At least, that's what I tell myself. The store clerk who said, "You're early today." There's something about convenience stores at 3 a.m. that feels like stepping outside of time. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, too bright and too white, casting everything in that sterile glow that makes your skin look slightly gray. The aisles are empty, the muzak is playing for no one, and the whole world outside the glass doors might as well not exist. I used to find it comforting, that liminal quality, a pocket of stillness carved out of the chaos of regular life. Now I can't set foot in one without my hands starting to shake. I worked the night shift at a distribution warehouse on the edge of the city, the kind of job where you clock in at 10 p.m. and clock out at 6 a.m, and somewhere in between you lose all sense of what day it is or whether the sun still exists. The work was mindless, scanning packages, loading trucks, listening to podcasts through one earbud while the conveyor belts hummed their endless mechanical song. But it paid well enough, and I didn't mind the hours. I'd always been a night person anyway, even before the divorce. Afterward, it was almost a relief to have an excuse to be awake when everyone else was sleeping, to exist on a schedule that didn't require me to pretend I was okay. The convenience store was on my route home, a little place called Quick Mart that squatted on the corner of Riverside and 4th like it had been there forever. I started stopping in a few times a week, mostly for energy drinks and the occasionally decent breakfast sandwich, but also because it gave me a reason to delay going back to my empty apartment. The fluorescent limbo of that store felt less lonely than my living room at 4 in the morning, and the clerk who worked the night shift was friendly enough to make small talk without being pushy about it. His name was Dennis, or at least that's what his name tag said. He was maybe mid-40s, with thinning brown hair and a soft, doughy face that always seemed to be smiling. Not a big smile, just a pleasant, default expression that made you feel like he was genuinely happy to see you, even at 3:30 in the morning when most people could barely muster basic human courtesy. He remembered my usual order, large coffee, black, and whatever sandwich looked the least stale, and he'd have it ready by the time I reached the counter on the nights when the store was empty, and he'd seen me pull into the parking lot. I appreciated that, the small kindness of being recognized. After the divorce, after moving to a new city where I didn't know anyone, those brief interactions were sometimes the only conversations I had outside of work. Dennis would ask how my night was going, comment on the weather, occasionally share some mundane observation about the news or local sports. Nothing deep, nothing personal, just the comfortable rhythm of two people acknowledging each other's existence in the dead hours of the night. It went on like that for about 4 months before anything felt wrong. The night it started was a Thursday in early February, one of those bitter cold evenings where the wind cuts right through your jacket and the air hurts to breathe. We'd gotten slammed at the warehouse, some backlog from a shipping delay, and the supervisor had let us go 2 hours early once we'd cleared it. I was exhausted but wired, that strange state where your body is screaming for sleep but your brain won't stop buzzing. So I decided to make my usual stop at Quick Mart, even though it was only 1:30 instead of my typical 3:45. Dennis was behind the counter when I walked in, same as always, and he looked up with that familiar soft smile as the door chimed. But something flickered across his face when he saw me, surprise maybe, or something harder to name, and the first words out of his mouth made me stop halfway to the coffee station. "You're early today." I laughed because it seemed like a joke, or at least a casual observation. "Yeah, we got out ahead of schedule. Figured I'd still grab my coffee." He nodded slowly, his eyes following me as I moved toward the back of the store. "That's not like you. You're usually here at 3:45, sometimes 3:50 if traffic is bad on the highway." I paused with my hand on the coffee pot, something cold prickling at the base of my spine. He was right. I did usually get there around that time, give or take a few minutes, depending on how smoothly the shift ended. But I'd never mentioned that to him. I'd never mentioned my schedule at all, had never told him what time I got off work or which route I took to get there. Those were just things he'd have to notice on his own, pay attention to, keep track of over weeks and months of watching me come and go. "Lucky guess," I said, forcing a smile as I filled my cup. "I'm pretty predictable, I guess." "You are," Dennis agreed, and there was something in his voice that made the prickling sensation spread across my shoulders. Creature of habit. Large black coffee, turkey sandwich if we have it, ham and cheese if we don't. You always park in the second spot from the door, always come in through the left side, always check your phone while you're waiting in line even when there's no one else here. I turned to look at him. He was still smiling, still wearing that pleasant, friendly expression, but his eyes weren't matching it anymore. They were fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach tighten, like he was cataloging my reaction, filing it away for later reference. "That's pretty observant," I managed. "I pay attention," he said simply. "It's important to pay attention to the people who matter." I didn't know what to say to that. The words hung in the air between us, strange and heavy, and for a long moment the only sound was the buzz of the fluorescent lights and the distant hum of the refrigerator case. I grabbed a sandwich without looking at what kind it was, paid in cash so I wouldn't have to wait for the card machine, and got out of there as fast as I could without actually running. The whole drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The specificity of what he'd said. 3:45, sometimes 3:50. The second spot from the door, the left side entrance. Those weren't things you noticed casually. Those were things you tracked, things you recorded, things you studied, like a scientist observing a subject or a predator learning the patterns of its prey. I told myself I was overreacting. He was just a friendly guy with a good memory, probably bored out of his mind working the graveyard shift at a convenience store with nothing to do but watch customers come and go. It didn't mean anything. It wasn't sinister. I was just tired and stressed and reading too much into a weird conversation. But I locked my apartment door twice that night. And I didn't sleep until the sun was fully up, painting my bedroom ceiling in shades of pale winter gold. I avoided the Quick Mart for almost 2 weeks after that. Told myself it was because I'd found a better coffee place closer to my apartment, or because I was trying to save money, or because I was finally getting my sleep schedule under control and didn't need the late-night ritual anymore. All of those things were technically true, but none of them were the real reason. The real reason was that I couldn't stop hearing Dennis's voice in my head, that calm recitation of my habits and patterns, the way he'd said, "the people who matter," like it was the most natural thing in the world. I started going to a different store, a gas station about a mile out of my way that had worse coffee, and a clerk who barely looked up from her phone when I paid. It was impersonal and slightly inconvenient, and exactly what I needed. Just a transaction, nothing more, no one paying attention to when I arrived, or where I parked, or which door I used. I felt ridiculous for letting one weird conversation drive me out of my routine, but I also felt safer, and safety won. Then Dennis showed up at my apartment. It was a Sunday afternoon, my one day off, and I'd been half asleep on the couch watching some documentary I wasn't really following when someone knocked on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I never expected anyone. That was kind of the point of my solitary existence. So I figured it was a delivery driver with a wrong address, or maybe a neighbor needing to borrow something. I shuffled over in my sweatpants and opened the door without checking the peephole, because it was 2 in the afternoon on a quiet Sunday and what could possibly go wrong. Dennis was standing in my hallway, wearing street clothes instead of his Quick Mart polo, holding a plastic bag in one hand and smiling that soft, doughy smile. "Hey there," he said, like we'd run into each other at a party, like this was normal, like he hadn't just appeared at my home without invitation or explanation. "I haven't seen you in a while. Wanted to make sure you were okay." I stood there with my hand on the doorframe, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. The man from the convenience store was at my apartment. He was at my home. He knew where I lived, not just which building, but which unit, which floor, which door to knock on. I hadn't told him any of that. I'd never told him anything about my personal life beyond the most basic small talk about the weather and how tired I was after my shift. "How did you find me?" The words came out flat, strange, like someone else was saying them. Dennis's smile didn't waver. "I told you, I pay attention. You mentioned your apartment complex once, a few months back, said something about the elevators being slow. After that, it wasn't hard to figure out which unit." He held up the plastic bag, and through the thin white material, I could see the familiar shape of a coffee cup and what looked like a wrapped sandwich. "I brought you your usual. Figured you might be missing it." My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to slam the door, to call the police, to do something other than stand there like a deer caught in headlights. But I couldn't move. I kept thinking there had to be an innocent explanation, that maybe I was misreading the situation, that maybe this was just an extremely awkward attempt at friendship from a lonely guy who didn't understand boundaries. "That's really thoughtful," I heard myself say. "But I'm actually about to head out, so..." "No, you're not." His voice was still pleasant, still friendly, but something in it had shifted. "You never go anywhere on Sundays? You stay home and watch TV and order delivery around 6, Thai food usually. Sometimes pizza if you're feeling lazy." The world tilted sideways. He knew my Sunday routine. He knew what I ordered for dinner and when. Information I had never shared with him, had never shared with anyone, because who would care about the mundane details of my pathetic post-divorce existence? "I need you to leave," I said, and this time my voice came out stronger, sharper. "Right now." Dennis's smile finally faltered. Not much. Just a flicker, a brief tightening around the eyes, but enough to make him look like a different person for a split second. Someone colder, someone calculating. "I'm just trying to be friendly," he said, and there was a note of hurt in his voice that might have been genuine or might have been performance. "You stopped coming to the store. I was worried about you." "We're not friends, Dennis. You're a clerk at a store I used to go to. That's it." I started to close the door, my hand shaking on the frame. "Don't come here again." He didn't try to stop me. He just stood there as the gap between us narrowed, his eyes fixed on mine, that hurt expression slowly hardening into something I couldn't read. Just before the door clicked shut, he said, "I'll see you soon, Marcus." I locked the deadbolt, then the chain. Then I stood there with my back against the door, my heart racing, trying to remember if I'd ever told him my name. I hadn't. I was sure of it. I paid in cash, never used a card, never gave any identifying information. He would have had to find it some other way. Look up my license plate, maybe, or follow me home and check the mailboxes, or do something else I didn't want to think about, something that would require planning and effort and a level of obsession that made my stomach turn. I called in sick to work that night. Sat in my apartment with all the lights on, watching the door, flinching at every sound in the hallway. Around midnight, I finally worked up the courage to check the peephole, half expecting to see Dennis standing out there in the dim corridor light, waiting with that patient smile. The hallway was empty, but when I opened the door to double-check, I found the plastic bag sitting on my welcome mat. The coffee was still warm. He'd been there recently. He'd stood outside my door listening, waiting, and I hadn't heard a thing. The thought made my skin crawl so badly I wanted to tear it off. I kicked the bag down the hall without touching it and went back inside, locking everything again, checking the windows even though I was on the 4th floor and there was no fire escape, no balcony, no way anyone could get in from outside. But Dennis had already proven that locks and logic didn't matter much to someone who was determined enough. He'd found my apartment, learned my name, memorized my schedule down to what I ordered for dinner on my day off. The question wasn't whether he could get to me. The question was what he wanted when he did. I went to the police on Monday morning, sitting in a hard plastic chair at the precinct and explaining everything to an officer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I showed him the text I'd sent myself documenting Dennis's visit, described the bag left outside my door, explained the progression from weird comments at the store to showing up at my home uninvited. The officer took notes, nodded in the right places, and then told me there wasn't much they could do. "Has he threatened you directly?" he asked, pen hovering over his notepad. "Made any statements about wanting to hurt you?" I thought about it. Dennis hadn't said anything explicitly threatening, just unsettling, invasive, wrong. "No," I admitted. "But he knows where I live. He knows my schedule, my routines, things I never told him." He showed up at my door with coffee. The officer's expression softened slightly, but not in a way that made me feel better. It was the look you give someone who's scared of something you don't consider dangerous. "Look, I understand this is uncomfortable, but what you're describing sounds like someone who's socially awkward and doesn't understand boundaries. It's not illegal to be friendly, even if that friendliness is unwanted." I wanted to argue, wanted to make him understand that this wasn't awkwardness, that there was something calculated and predatory about the way Dennis had collected information about my life. But I could see it wouldn't matter. Without a direct threat, without evidence of a crime, I was just another paranoid citizen wasting their time. The officer gave me a pamphlet about personal safety and suggested I consider getting a restraining order if the behavior continued. Then he called the next person in line, and I walked out feeling more alone than ever. That night, I went back to work because I couldn't afford not to, but I was distracted the entire shift, dropping packages, missing scans, zoning out during the safety briefings. My supervisor pulled me aside around 2 in the morning and asked if everything was okay. I told her I was dealing with some personal stuff, and she nodded sympathetically, said to let her know if I needed to adjust my schedule. I thanked her and went back to the conveyor belt and tried not to think about whether Dennis was out there somewhere, watching the warehouse parking lot, tracking when my car arrived and when it left. I took a different route home that morning, adding 20 minutes to my commute just to avoid driving past the Quick Mart. It felt paranoid and probably pointless, but it also felt necessary, a small act of defiance, a way of taking back some control over my own movements. I pulled into my apartment complex as the sun was coming up, exhausted and jittery, and that's when I noticed my living room light was on. I always turned off all the lights before leaving for work, always. It was one of those ingrained habits from childhood, my mother's voice in my head reminding me about the electric bill every time I walked out of a room. I sat in my car, staring up at my window, the 4th floor, the yellowish glow behind the curtains that shouldn't have been there. Maybe I'd forgotten. Maybe I'd been so distracted yesterday that I'd left it on without thinking. It was possible. It had to be possible. I sat there for 15 minutes before I could make myself go inside. The apartment looked normal when I opened the door. Same furniture, same mess of dishes in the sink, same pile of laundry I kept meaning to fold. Nothing obviously disturbed, nothing missing or moved. I checked every room, every closet, even got down on my hands and knees to look under the bed like a child afraid of monsters. Empty. I was alone, but the light had been off when I left. I was sure of it. I was about to convince myself I was losing my mind when I noticed the notebook on my kitchen counter. It was spiral bound, the kind you can buy at any drugstore, and it was sitting next to my coffee maker in a spot where I definitely hadn't left anything. My hands were shaking as I picked it up, flipped it open, and felt the floor drop out from under me. It was a log, dates, times, observations, all written in neat, careful handwriting that I somehow knew belonged to Dennis, even though I'd never seen his writing before. The entries went back months, long before that first uncomfortable conversation at the Quick Mart. He'd been watching me since the beginning, maybe since the first time I walked into his store. November 3rd, 2:47 a.m., subject purchased large coffee and turkey sandwich. Seemed tired, distracted. Wedding ring tan line visible on left hand, recently divorced. Note, follows same route every night, arrives within 10-minute window. November 15th, 3:12 a.m., subject mentioned slow elevators at apartment complex. Cross-referenced with route and narrowed to 3 possible buildings. Will investigate further. December 2nd, 4:01 a.m., confirmed address, Unit 412. Subject lives alone, no regular visitors. Mail includes credit card statements and medical bills, possible financial stress, divorce settlement. The entries continued for pages, dozens of them, each one more detailed than the last. He'd documented everything, my work schedule, my eating habits, the shows I watched based on the flickering light patterns through my window, the names of the delivery drivers who came to my door. There were observations about my emotional state, speculation about my mental health, notes about how isolated I seemed and how much I clearly needed someone to take care of me. The last entry was dated yesterday, February 19th, 2:15 p.m., made contact at subject's residence. Brought coffee and sandwich as gesture of care. Subject seemed frightened, defensive, unexpected. Perhaps moved too quickly. Will need to recalibrate approach. Left offering outside door as reminder of my presence. Subject retrieved it. Good sign. Patience is required. He will understand eventually. I dropped the notebook like it had burned me, my whole body trembling so hard I had to grab the counter to stay upright. He'd been inside my apartment. While I was gone, while I was sitting at the police station trying to get someone to take me seriously, Dennis had walked into my home and left this journal for me to find. A message. A demonstration of how completely he'd invaded my life. How thoroughly he owned every detail of my existence. And I hadn't retrieved that bag from outside my door. I'd kicked it away. left it in the hallway, which meant he'd been watching. He'd seen what I did with his offering and interpreted it however he wanted, twisted it into evidence that supported whatever delusion was driving him. I called the police again, and this time they sent someone to take a report. They dusted for fingerprints, took the notebook as evidence, asked me a lot of questions I didn't have answers to. But I could tell from their faces that they were as lost as I was. Dennis hadn't left any obvious trace of how he'd gotten in. No broken locks, no jimmied windows, nothing to suggest forced entry. Either he had a key somehow, or he picked the lock, or there was some other explanation that I couldn't fathom and didn't want to think about. The officer who dismissed me that morning showed up as part of the response team, and he had the decency to look embarrassed. "We're going to take this seriously," he told me, and I wanted to laugh in his face. They were going to take it seriously now, after Dennis had already proven he could walk into my home whenever he wanted. What good did that do me? They told me to stay somewhere else for a few days while they investigated. I didn't have anywhere to go, so I checked into a motel on the other side of the city, paying cash and using a fake name like I was some kind of fugitive. I lay in that unfamiliar bed, listening to the traffic outside and the muffled sounds of the TV next door, and I tried to figure out how my life had turned into this, how a few late-night coffee runs had spiraled into hiding from a man who decided I belonged to him. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I opened it with numb fingers, already knowing what I'd see. "The motel is a nice touch. Room 118, right? I like that you're being careful. It shows you understand how important this is. Don't worry, Marcus. I'm patient. I can wait as long as it takes." He'd followed me. Somehow, despite everything, he'd followed me here. I was out of that bed before I finished processing the message, grabbing my keys and my wallet and shoving my feet into my shoes without bothering to tie them. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the deadbolt, and when I finally got the door open, I half expected Dennis to be standing right there in the corridor, that patient smile on his face, waiting for me like he'd been waiting all along. But the hallway was empty, just stained carpet and flickering overhead lights and the distant sound of someone's television bleeding through the walls. I ran for the lobby, my untied shoes slapping against the floor, and I must have looked insane to the night clerk, wild-eyed, panting, asking if anyone had been asking about me, if anyone had come in looking for a guest in room 118. She stared at me like I was on drugs and said no one had asked. Was everything okay? I didn't answer. I just pushed through the front doors and sprinted for my car, jamming the key into the ignition and peeling out of the parking lot so fast my tires squealed on the asphalt. I drove without thinking, without direction, just putting distance between myself and that motel room where Dennis knew I was sleeping. The streets were empty at this hour, just me and the occasional delivery truck and the endless stream of traffic lights cycling through their colors for no one. I called 911 from the car, trying to explain the situation to a dispatcher who sounded increasingly confused by my fragmented, panicked account. She told me to pull over somewhere safe and wait for officers to meet me, so I stopped at a 24-hour diner near the highway and sat in the parking lot with my doors locked and my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. 2 patrol cars showed up about 15 minutes later. I showed them the text, explained about the notebook, gave them Dennis's name and description and the address of the Quick Mart where he worked. They made calls, ran his information, and that's when things started to come together in a way that made my blood run cold. Dennis Michael Pruitt. 51 years old, not mid-40s like I'd guessed. 3 prior arrests for stalking, 2 restraining orders from different states, a 6-month stint in a psychiatric facility after his last victim, a woman in Ohio, had moved 3 times trying to escape him before finally going to the FBI. He'd served 18 months for violating a federal restraining order, been released 2 years ago, and apparently relocated here to start fresh. The Quick Mart job was part of his parole requirements. He was supposed to be checking in with a supervising officer monthly, attending therapy, staying away from situations that might trigger his fixation behaviors. I sat in that diner parking lot listening to the officer recite this history. and I felt something shift inside me. All those months of small talk, of thinking I'd found a friendly face in the lonely hours of the night, it had never been real. I was never a person to Dennis. I was a project, a target, something to be studied and acquired. The coffee and the sandwiches and the casual conversations about the weather were just tools, ways of getting close enough to learn everything he needed to know. The officers told me they'd put out an alert for Dennis, that patrol cars would be looking for him throughout the city. They offered to escort me somewhere safe, a friend's house, a family member's place, anywhere I wanted to go. I told them I didn't have anyone, and I saw the pity in their eyes, the sad recognition of exactly how vulnerable I was. One of them gave me his card and told me to call immediately if I saw or heard anything. Then they drove away, and I was alone again. I couldn't go back to my apartment. I couldn't go back to the motel. I didn't have anywhere else, so I just drove, circling the city in aimless loops while the sky slowly lightened from black to gray to pale pink. I stopped for gas around 6 in the morning, standing at the pump in the cold dawn air, and that's when I saw his car pull into the lot. It was a beige sedan, the kind of forgettable vehicle you'd never notice in traffic, but I recognized it immediately because I'd seen it parked outside the Quick Mart 100 times. Dennis was behind the wheel, and when our eyes met through the windshield, he smiled. That same soft, patient smile he'd worn the first time he handed me my coffee and told me to have a good night. I yanked the nozzle out of my tank without waiting for it to finish, gas splashing on my shoes as I threw myself into the driver's seat. Dennis's car was blocking the exit. He'd positioned it perfectly, angled across the lane so I couldn't get past without going through him. I could see him getting out now, moving toward me with that calm, unhurried stride, and something in my brain went very quiet and very cold. I put my car in reverse and floored it. The impact when I hit the concrete barrier behind me was jarring, metal screaming against concrete, but I didn't stop. I spun the wheel, shifted into drive, and aimed straight for the narrow gap between Dennis's car and the pump island. He realized what I was doing a second too late. I saw his eyes widen, saw him start to move, and then I was past him, my side mirror clipping his bumper as I shot through the gap and onto the street. I ran 2 red lights getting out of there, my hands locked on the steering wheel so tight my knuckles had gone white. In my rearview mirror, I could see Dennis's car pulling out of the gas station, following, but I had a head start and I knew these streets better than he did. I took corners at random, ducking through residential neighborhoods and cutting through parking lots, until finally I was sure I'd lost him. I ended up at the police station, pulling into the lot and stumbling through the front doors and telling whoever would listen that Dennis Pruitt had just tried to corner me at a gas station. They took me seriously this time. It's amazing how much more attention you get when there's already a file open and a suspect with a history. Within an hour, they'd tracked Dennis's car to a parking garage downtown and found him sitting inside, engine running, like he was waiting for something. He didn't resist when they arrested him. He just smiled and said, "Tell Marcus I'll see him soon." The detective who interviewed me later told me what they'd found in Dennis's car: a duffel bag containing zip ties, duct tape, a hunting knife, and a syringe filled with something the lab was still testing. There was also a notebook, a different one, newer, filled with detailed plans for what he called our transition. He'd written about how he was going to help me understand that we belonged together, how the resistance was natural at first, but would fade once I accepted the truth. The final pages described a cabin somewhere upstate that he'd been preparing for months, soundproofed, remote, a place where we could be together without interference. I sat in that interview room listening to the detective describe what had almost happened to me, what would have happened if I'd been a little slower at that gas station or a little less willing to ram my car through a concrete barrier, and I couldn't feel anything. Just numb, just hollow. Like all the fear and adrenaline had burned out of me and left nothing but ash. Dennis was charged with stalking, attempted kidnapping, and a handful of other offenses that his lawyer would probably try to plea down to something manageable. The detective said they'd push for the maximum, that his history would work against him, that I'd probably have to testify, but that they'd do everything they could to make it as painless as possible. I nodded and thanked her and walked out of that station into the cold morning light, and I had no idea what to do next. I quit my job the same week they arrested Dennis. Couldn't stomach the idea of going back to those night shifts, driving past the Quick Mart even if I took the long way around, existing in those dark hours when he'd spent months watching and cataloging and planning. My supervisor was understanding about it, said she'd give me a good reference whenever I was ready to start looking again, and I thanked her without mentioning that I had no intention of ever working nights again. That part of my life was over. Dennis had poisoned it completely. The trial took almost a year to actually happen. Continuances, motions, all the legal machinery that grinds so slowly when you're the one waiting for resolution. I testified for 2 days, sitting in that witness box and describing everything from the first "You're early today" comment to the moment I rammed my car through the gas station exit with his headlights filling my rearview mirror. His lawyer tried to paint me as paranoid, suggested I'd misinterpreted friendly gestures from a lonely man, implied that the contents of the duffel bag could have had innocent explanations. I didn't let it rattle me. I just kept talking, kept telling the truth, and trusted the jury to see what I saw. They convicted him on all counts. 12 years in federal prison, plus 5 years of supervised release, plus a lifetime registration as a stalking offender in every state he ever sets foot in. The judge called his behavior predatory and methodical, and noted that his prior history suggested he would absolutely offend again if given the opportunity. I sat in the back of that courtroom when the sentence was read, and I watched Dennis's face for some flicker of emotion. Remorse, anger, anything. There was nothing. Just that same soft, patient expression, like he was listening to someone describe the weather. He looked at me once, right before they let him out, caught my eye across the room and held it for a long moment, and then he smiled. Not the pleasant customer service smile from the Quick Mart, but something smaller, more private. A smile that said this isn't over. A smile that said 12 years isn't forever. I held his gaze until the bailiff took his arm and guided him through the side door, and then I walked out of the courthouse and sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could make my hands stop shaking enough to drive. I moved to a different state after the trial. New city, new apartment, new job working normal hours at a logistics company where I'm home by 6 every evening and asleep by midnight like a regular person. I don't know anyone here yet, haven't made any real friends, but that feels safer right now than the alternative. Every relationship starts with a stranger after all, and I've learned what strangers are capable of when you're not paying attention. The apartment I chose is on the 2nd floor, high enough that no one can see in through the windows, but low enough that I can get out fast if I need to. I had a security system installed before I moved in a single box. Cameras, motion sensors, an alarm that goes straight to the monitoring company and the police. I check the footage every morning and every night, scrolling through hours of empty hallways and quiet parking lots, looking for anything out of place. I haven't found anything yet. I probably never will. But I can't stop looking. I don't go to convenience stores anymore. Can't bring myself to walk through those automatic doors and stand under those fluorescent lights and make small talk with whoever's working the register. It's not rational. I know the odds of encountering another Dennis are vanishingly small. Know that most late-night clerks are just tired people trying to get through their shifts, same as I was. But every time I think about stopping somewhere for coffee or a snack, I feel that cold prickle on the back of my neck, that weight of attention, and I just keep driving. Some associations can't be unlearned. My therapist says I'm making progress. She says the hypervigilance will fade eventually, that my nervous system will learn to distinguish between real threats and phantom ones. She says I've already done the hardest part, survived, testified, put my abuser behind bars, and that everything from here is just about rebuilding. I want to believe her. Some days I almost do. Other days I lie awake at 3 a.m, the hour when I used to be standing at a counter, making small talk with a man who was already planning how to take me apart. And I wonder if I'll ever feel safe again. 12 years. That's how long Dennis will be in prison, assuming he doesn't get early release for good behavior. 12 years sounds like a long time until you realize it's not. that I'll only be in my early 40s when he gets out, still young enough to have most of my life ahead of me. And he'll be out there too, older, but probably not changed. That patient smile still fixed on his face, those notebooks full of observations and plans probably still vivid in his memory. The detective told me they'd notify me when he's released, that there are systems in place to track offenders like him, that I shouldn't spend my life worrying about something that might never happen. But Dennis spent months watching me before I ever noticed him. He learned my routines, my habits, my vulnerabilities, all while I smiled and thanked him for remembering my coffee order. He was invisible until he wasn't, harmless until he wasn't, and by the time I understood the danger, he already knew everything about me. I think about the other people Dennis watched before me, the woman in Ohio who had to go to the FBI, whoever came before her, whoever came before them. I think about how each of them probably started the same way I did, grateful for a friendly face in a lonely moment, never suspecting what was building behind that pleasant smile. I wonder how many of them are still looking over their shoulders, still checking their locks 3 times before bed, still flinching at the sound of footsteps behind them in empty parking lots. I wonder if any of them have managed to stop. I'm trying to build a new life. I'm trying to let go of the fear, to trust that the system worked and Dennis is where he belongs, and I'm finally safe. Most days I can almost convince myself it's true. I go to work, I come home, I eat dinner and watch TV and go to bed at a reasonable hour. I'm learning to exist in the daylight again, to find comfort in routine without letting that routine become a cage. But I don't stop at convenience stores. I don't make small talk with strangers. And every time someone remembers my name without being told, every time someone notices a pattern in my behavior that I never mentioned, I feel that cold prickle start to spread. Because here's the thing about being hunted. You never really stop looking for the next predator. You just get better at watching back. So Dennis, if you're reading this somehow, if you're sitting in your cell thinking about me the way you used to think about me from behind that counter, I want you to know something. I'm not the same person I was when you found me. I'm not trusting anymore. I'm not comfortable. I don't seek out friendly faces in the small hours of the morning. Don't crave connection badly enough to ignore the warning signs. You taught me that. You taught me what people are capable of when they decide you belong to them. And in 12 years, when they let you out, I'll still remember every lesson. I'll be watching. And this time, I'll see you coming. Story 5. The hand that grabbed my ankle under the bed. The house was a steal, which should have been my first warning. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a big backyard with an old oak tree, all for $800 a month in a city where studios were going for $1,200. The landlord said it had been vacant for a while, that the last tenants had left suddenly and he just wanted someone reliable in there. I was 22, freshly graduated, and desperate to prove I could make it on my own after 4 years of roommates and dorm life. I signed the lease the same day I toured it. The place had character, which is real estate code for old and slightly falling apart. The floors creaked in places, the windows stuck if you didn't lift them just right, and the basement door had a lock on the outside that I thought was strange until I figured it was probably to keep kids from wandering down there. The previous tenants had left behind some furniture, a couch, a kitchen table, a bed frame in the master bedroom, which the landlord said I was welcome to use or throw out as I pleased. I kept most of it. I was broke, and free furniture was free furniture. Moving in took most of a rainy Saturday in early October. I didn't have much, just my clothes, my books, a few kitchen things my mom had pressed on me when I'd announced I was getting my own place. By evening, I was exhausted, sitting on the inherited couch eating pizza out of the box and listening to the rain drum against the windows. The house felt huge around me, all those empty rooms and shadowy corners, but I told myself I'd get used to it. Everyone feels strange in a new place at first. It didn't mean anything. That first week was mostly unpacking and figuring out the house's quirks. The hot water took forever to arrive, but once it did, it stayed scalding. The thermostat was temperamental and seemed to have a mind of its own. I'd set it to 68 and wake up sweating at 3 in the morning because it had cranked itself up to 80. The ice maker in the freezer made a grinding noise every few hours that sounded almost like someone clearing their throat. Normal old house stuff. Nothing to worry about. I started my new job that Monday, an entry-level position at a marketing firm downtown that paid just enough to cover rent and groceries with a little left over. The hours were long and the work was tedious, but I was grateful to have it. I'd come home around 6, make dinner, watch TV until I couldn't keep my eyes open, then fall into bed and sleep like the dead until my alarm went off. It was a good routine, a grown-up routine, and I felt proud of myself for managing it. The first strange thing happened about 2 weeks after I moved in. I came home from work and found one of my kitchen cabinets standing open. Not all the way, just an inch or two, like someone had closed it but not quite latched it. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to remember if I'd left it that way. I was pretty sure I hadn't. I was compulsive about closing cabinets, one of those weird little habits I'd picked up from my mother who couldn't stand the sight of an open door. But I'd also been exhausted lately, running on too little sleep and too much coffee, and memory isn't always reliable when you're that tired. I closed the cabinet, made dinner, and forgot about it. Then it happened again 3 days later. Different cabinet, same thing, cracked open, not quite latched, like someone had been rummaging through my dishes while I was at work. I checked everything, counted my plates and glasses like I expected some to be missing, but it was all there. Nothing taken, nothing disturbed. Just that open door, unexplained. I mentioned it to my coworker Brianna during lunch the next day, laughing it off as a quirk of the old house. Maybe the cabinets didn't close right, I said. Maybe there was a draft pushing them open. She nodded like that made sense, but there was something in her expression that made me hesitate. "You're living alone, right?" she asked. "In that big house?" I told her yes, and she was quiet for a moment before shrugging and changing the subject. I didn't ask what she'd been thinking. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The noises started around the same time, though I didn't connect them at first. Little sounds in the night. A creak from the hallway, a thump from somewhere below me. The kind of ambient noise every old house makes as it settles and shifts. I'd lie in bed listening, telling myself it was normal, telling myself the house was just adjusting to my presence the way I was adjusting to it. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like footsteps, soft and careful, but when I got up to check, there was never anything there. Just empty rooms and shadows and my own reflection in the dark windows. The bed in the master bedroom was an old wooden frame with a high clearance, at least 2 feet of space between the floor and the bottom of the mattress. I'd shoved some storage boxes under there when I moved in, plastic bins full of winter clothes and old textbooks I couldn't bring myself to throw away. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear sounds coming from under the bed, rustling, shifting, a soft scrape like something being dragged across the hardwood. Mice, I told myself. Old houses have mice. I made a mental note to buy traps and then forgot about it. The way you forget about things when you're too tired and too busy and too determined to believe that everything is fine. It was a Thursday night, almost a month after I moved in, when I finally couldn't ignore it anymore. I'd woken up around 2 in the morning needing to use the bathroom, and I was sitting on the edge of the bed, feet dangling, trying to summon the energy to stand up. The house was quiet, except for the rain pattering against the windows and the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Normal sounds, safe sounds. Then I felt it, fingers wrapping around my ankle, cold and firm, gripping tight from under the bed. For one endless second, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but sit there frozen while my brain tried to process what was happening. The grip tightened, pulling slightly, and something under the bed shifted, a rustle of fabric, a soft exhale of breath. And that's when I screamed. I kicked out hard, yanking my leg free, and threw myself across the bed toward the nightstand where I'd left my phone. The lamp went crashing to the floor as I scrambled for it, plunging the room into darkness except for the faint glow of the street light outside my window. I could hear movement, something sliding across the floor, fast, toward the bedroom door, and then footsteps pounding down the hallway and the bang of the basement door slamming shut. I didn't chase them. I huddled on top of my bed with my phone clutched against my chest and my back pressed against the headboard, shaking so hard my teeth were chattering. I called 911 with fingers that barely worked, stammering out my address and something about an intruder, someone in my house, someone who had grabbed me from under my bed. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line, that officers were on their way, and I sat there in the dark listening to her calm voice and trying not to throw up. The police arrived in 8 minutes that felt like 8 hours. 2 officers swept through the house with their flashlights and their hands on their weapons, while I stood in the front yard wrapped in a blanket one of them had pulled from my couch. They checked every room, every closet, every corner where a person could hide. They checked the basement, which I hadn't been down to since I'd moved in because it creeped me out even before all this. They found the back door unlocked, a door I was certain I'd locked, a door I locked every single night before bed. And they found signs that someone had been accessing the house through there for a while. "Looks like there's a sleeping bag in the basement," one of the officers told me, his face grim in the red and blue glow of the patrol car lights. "Some food wrappers, bottles of water. Whoever it was, they've been coming and going for a while, probably through that back door." He paused, and I could see him choosing his next words carefully. "There's also a hole in the basement ceiling. Leads up to the crawl space under the first floor. From there, someone could access various parts of the house." I stared at him, not understanding at first. Then it clicked, and I felt my legs go weak. The crawl space, the space under the floors, the space under my bed, where I'd been hearing those rustling, shifting sounds for weeks, where something with cold fingers had reached out and grabbed my ankle in the dark. "You're saying someone was living in my house," I said, and my voice sounded flat and strange, like it was coming from very far away. "Under my house, this whole time." The officer nodded slowly. "It happens more than you'd think, unfortunately. Vacant properties, houses with basements or attics that don't get checked often. People find ways in and set up camp. Usually they're just looking for shelter, but sometimes..." He trailed off, but I could fill in the blank myself. Sometimes they wanted more than shelter. Sometimes they wanted something else entirely. They dusted for fingerprints, took photos of the basement setup, asked me a lot of questions I didn't have answers to. Had I noticed anything missing? Had I seen anyone suspicious in the neighborhood? Had I told anyone I was living alone? I answered as best I could, but my brain felt like it was wrapped in cotton, struggling to process what had happened, what was still happening. Someone had been in my house. Someone had been under my bed, close enough to touch me, for God knows how long. Watching me sleep, listening to me breathe, waiting. The officers told me I should stay somewhere else for a few nights while they investigated. I called Brianna at 3 a.m, crying so hard I could barely speak, and she drove over immediately and took me back to her apartment. I sat on her couch wrapped in blankets with a mug of tea I couldn't drink, and I told her everything. The cabinets, the noises, the hand around my ankle, the sleeping bag in the basement. She listened without interrupting, her face pale, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "The landlord said the last tenants left suddenly," she said finally. "Did he tell you why?" I shook my head. I hadn't asked. I'd been so excited about the low rent, so eager to prove I could make it on my own, that I hadn't thought to question why the place was such a good deal. Now sitting in Brianna's living room at 4 a.m, I couldn't believe how stupid I'd been. The police called me the next afternoon with an update. They'd run the fingerprints from the basement and gotten a hit. A man named Thomas Vance, 47 years old, with a long history of burglary and trespassing charges. He'd done 2 stints in prison, the last one ending about 18 months ago, and he'd been off the radar ever since. No known address, no known employment, nothing. He'd simply disappeared into the margins of the world, and apparently he'd found his way into my basement. "We've issued a warrant for his arrest," the detective told me. "We're looking for him. In the meantime, I'd recommend you don't return to that house alone. Is there somewhere you can stay?" I told him I was with a friend, thanked him for the update, and hung up feeling no better than before. Thomas Vance. I had a name now, a face I could look up in public records, a history I could trace through court documents and newspaper articles. But none of that changed the fact that he was still out there somewhere, still free, and that he'd spent weeks living in the space beneath my bedroom floor. I didn't go back to the house for almost a week. Brianna offered to let me stay as long as I needed, but I could tell it was wearing on her. Her one-bedroom apartment wasn't meant for 2 people, and my presence was disrupting her routine in ways she was too polite to mention. So on the following Saturday, I asked her to come with me while I packed up my things. I couldn't stay there anymore, couldn't sleep in that bedroom, couldn't even look at that bed without feeling phantom fingers closing around my ankle. But I needed my stuff, and I needed to see the place one more time. Needed to understand what had been happening under my roof while I'd been going about my life, oblivious and vulnerable. We pulled into the driveway around noon, the autumn sun bright and warm in a way that felt almost mocking. The house looked exactly the same as always, quiet, ordinary, the kind of place you'd drive past without a second glance. I sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the front door, trying to make myself move. "You don't have to do this," Brianna said quietly. "We can hire movers. You don't ever have to go back in there." But I was already getting out of the car. I needed to see. I needed to know. The police tape across the basement door was the first thing I noticed when we went inside. Bright yellow, marking the scene of something terrible, turning my new home into a crime scene. I didn't go down there. I couldn't. Instead, I walked through the first floor, looking at everything with new eyes, trying to figure out where he'd been, what he'd touched, how much of my life he'd witnessed without my knowledge. The cabinets, I realized. The ones I'd found standing open. He'd been going through my things, probably while I was at work, probably while I was sleeping just a few feet above him. The thermostat that kept cranking itself up. Maybe that was him too, coming up through the crawl space in the night, making adjustments to the house like he lived there. Because he did live there, I realized with a sickening lurch. He'd lived there longer than I had. I was the intruder. I was the one who'd moved into his space. Then Brianna called my name from the bedroom, and something in her voice made my blood turn to ice. She was standing next to the bed, staring down at the floor, her face the color of old paper. I crossed the room to stand beside her, and at first I didn't understand what I was looking at. There was a hole in the hardwood, maybe 3 inches across, cut into the floor right beneath where my head would rest when I was sleeping. It had been covered with a piece of wood the same color as the surrounding floor, fitted so precisely that you'd never notice it unless you were looking directly down from the right angle. The piece had been moved aside, pushed a few inches to the left, and through the gap I could see nothing but darkness, the crawl space beneath where Thomas Vance had apparently spent his nights. "He was watching you," Brianna whispered, "through the floor, while you slept." I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I just stood there staring at that hole, that impossible violation, and felt something inside me crack and give way. He'd been right there, inches below my head, looking up at me through this little window he'd carved into my bedroom floor. For how long? The whole month I'd been living here? Longer than that, with the previous tenants, the ones who'd left so suddenly. I stumbled backward and sat down hard on the edge of the bed, which was a mistake because sitting there made me think about all the other nights I'd sat in this exact spot, feet dangling, completely unaware of what was lurking beneath me. My skin was crawling so badly I wanted to tear it off, and I couldn't stop my mind from replaying every night I'd spent in this room. Every time I'd changed clothes, every time I'd gotten out of the shower and walked around in a towel, every time I'd fallen asleep thinking I was alone and safe. He'd been there for all of it, watching, waiting, building up to something. Brianna was on her phone, calling the police, telling them we'd found something they needed to see. I heard her voice, as if from a great distance, muffled by the roaring in my ears. When she hung up, she came to sit beside me, wrapping her arm around my shoulders, and we stayed like that until the patrol car pulled into the driveway. The officers who responded weren't the same ones from that first night, but they'd clearly been briefed on the situation. They photographed the hole, the fitted cover, the angle that would have given someone a direct view of the pillow where I laid my head each night. One of them went down to the basement while the other stayed with us, asking questions I didn't have answers to. Had I noticed the hole before? Had I ever seen the cover moved? Had anything else in the house seemed disturbed? I shook my head to everything. I hadn't noticed because, why would I? Who looks for spy holes in their bedroom floor? The officer who'd gone to the basement came back up with a grim expression. "There's more down there," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "A lot more. We're going to need to call in the detective and get a full forensic team out here." I didn't want to know what he meant by more, but I found out anyway when Detective Marsh arrived 2 hours later and walked me through what they'd found. The basement wasn't just a place where Thomas Vance had been sleeping. It was a shrine. He'd set up a corner with photographs pinned to the walls, dozens of them, all of me. Me walking to my car, me taking out the trash, me through windows, through that hole in the floor, through angles I couldn't even identify. Some of them were clearly from before I'd moved in. The previous tenant, a woman about my age, captured in the same intimate, unknowing moments. And before her, another woman. And before that, another. "We think he's been using this house for years," Detective Marsh told me, her voice heavy. "The landlord said the properties had a lot of turnover. Tenants who break their leases early, who leave without explanation. We're reaching out to them now to see if any experienced anything similar." She paused, watching my face. "There are also journals. He's been writing about you since the day you moved in. I'm not going to share the specifics unless you want me to, but I need you to understand. This wasn't random. He targeted this house specifically because of its layout, because of the basement access. He's been doing this for a long time. The journals. He'd been writing about me, documenting his observations, probably describing his plans in that same careful, methodical way the other stalkers in those true crime podcasts always seemed to. I felt dizzy, like the floor was tilting beneath me, and I had to grab the back of a chair to keep from falling. "What about the previous tenants?" I heard myself ask. "The ones who left suddenly. Did something happen to them?" Detective Marsh hesitated, and in that hesitation I read everything I needed to know. "We're looking into it," she said finally. "A few of them have been difficult to locate. That could mean anything. People move, change their numbers, lose touch. But we're treating this as a priority investigation. Difficult to locate." The words echoed in my head, hollow and terrible. Those women, the ones in the photographs, the ones who'd slept in this bedroom before me, who'd sat on the edge of this bed with their feet dangling over the darkness. Where were they now? Had they escaped, like I had? Or had Thomas Vance decided at some point that watching wasn't enough? I couldn't stay in that house another minute. I walked out the front door and stood in the driveway, breathing in the cold autumn air, trying to convince myself that I was safe now, that I was outside in broad daylight, and nothing could hurt me here. Brianna came out a few minutes later with a box of my essentials: clothes, toiletries, my laptop, the things I'd need to survive until I could figure out what came next. She didn't say anything. She just loaded the box into her car and held the passenger door open for me, and I climbed in like a child being rescued from something too big to understand. The police kept me updated over the following days, calling with information I wasn't sure I wanted but couldn't stop myself from asking for. They'd found Thomas Vance's fingerprints all over the basement, confirming what we already knew. They'd found a key to the back door in his sleeping bag, which explained how he'd been coming and going so easily. They'd found tools, screwdrivers, a hand drill, a small saw that he'd used to modify the house, to carve out his little spy holes and access points over what must have been months or years of patient work. And they'd found a list, names and addresses, written in cramped handwriting on a piece of notebook paper tucked inside one of his journals. My name was there, along with the previous tenants. But there were other names, too. Women who'd never lived in that house, women in other parts of the city, women who might not know yet that they were being watched. The police were trying to contact all of them, but Thomas Vance was still out there, still free, still watching someone, probably, from some dark corner they didn't know to check. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that hand closing around my ankle, felt the cold pressure of fingers that had no right to touch me. Brianna's apartment felt safe in daylight, but at night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if there was a crawl space above me, wondering if someone could be up there right now, looking down through some hole I hadn't thought to look for. The fear had gotten inside me, burrowed deep, and I didn't know how to dig it out. It was 11 days after I'd left the house when I realized Thomas Vance had found me again. I'd been staying at Brianna's, sleeping on her couch, trying to function well enough to keep my job while the police investigation crawled forward. They still hadn't caught him. He'd gone to ground somewhere, vanished into whatever shadows he'd been living in before he'd claimed that basement as his own. Detective Marsh called me every few days with updates that weren't really updates, assurances that they were doing everything they could, reminders to stay vigilant and report anything unusual. I thanked her each time and hung up, feeling no safer than before. Brianna had gone to visit her parents for the weekend, which meant I had the apartment to myself for the first time since this whole nightmare began. I'd thought I'd enjoy the solitude, the chance to fall apart without an audience, but instead the empty rooms felt oppressive, full of shadows and silence. I double-checked the locks on the door and windows, made sure the chain was fastened, told myself I was being paranoid. This was a third-floor apartment in a secure building with a coded entry system. Thomas Vance had no way of knowing I was here. He couldn't have followed me. I'd been so careful, burying my roots, watching for anyone behind me on the streets. I was safe. I almost believed it until I found the photograph. It was tucked under the windshield wiper of my car when I went down to the parking garage that evening. Just a simple Polaroid in a plastic sleeve to protect it from the light rain that had been falling all day. The image showed me through a window, Brianna's window, the living room where I'd been sleeping, taken from an angle that could only mean he'd been standing on the fire escape outside. I was on the couch, wrapped in blankets, my face slack with exhaustion. The timestamp in the corner said it had been taken 2 nights ago. I dropped the photograph like it had burned me and spun around, scanning the garage for any sign of movement. The concrete pillars cast long shadows under the fluorescent lights, and every one of them could have been hiding someone. I couldn't see anyone, couldn't hear anything except the distant drip of water and the hum of the ventilation system. But he'd been here, recently, close enough to touch my car to leave his little message where he knew I'd find it. I ran back upstairs and locked myself in the apartment, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the deadbolt. I called 911, then Detective Marsh, then Brianna, leaving frantic voicemails when none of them answered. The walls felt like they were closing in around me. He'd found Brianna's address somehow, had stood outside her window watching me sleep, had probably been watching the whole time I'd thought I was hidden and safe. Nowhere was safe. Nowhere would ever be safe again. The police came and took the photograph, dusted my car for prints, swept the building's security footage for any sign of Thomas Vance. They found him on camera from 2 nights ago, just like the timestamp said. A grainy figure in dark clothes climbing the fire escape, pressing himself against the wall outside Brianna's window, staying there for almost an hour before climbing back down and disappearing into the alley. An hour. He'd watched me sleep for an hour, and I'd never known, never felt anything, never woken up with that prickle on my neck that's supposed to warn you when you're being observed. We're increasing patrols in the area, the officer told me, but I could see in his face that he knew it wasn't enough. Thomas Vance had evaded them for weeks now, had proven he could find me no matter where I went, could stand outside my window in the middle of the night without triggering any alarms. Patrol cars driving by weren't going to stop someone like that. I couldn't stay at Brianna's anymore, couldn't put her at risk, couldn't keep sleeping in a room he'd already found. I booked a hotel room downtown, paying cash, and using a fake name like that would somehow make a difference. The room was on the 14th floor, no fire escape, no balcony, nothing but a sheer drop outside the windows. I pushed the desk in front of the door and sat on the bed with the lights on, watching the clock tick toward midnight and then past it. Around 2 in the morning, someone knocked on my door. 3 soft taps, almost polite, like a neighbor asking to borrow sugar. I stopped breathing. The knock came again, a little louder this time, and then a voice, quiet, muffled by the door, but unmistakably male. "I know you're in there," he said. "I can hear you breathing. You breathe differently when you're scared. Did you know that? I've listened to you sleep so many times. I know exactly what you sound like when you're afraid." I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering my location to the dispatcher, telling her someone was trying to get into my room. She told me to stay calm, that officers were on their way, that I should stay away from the door and not engage with whoever was outside. I pressed myself into the corner farthest from the entrance, the phone clutched against my chest, and listened to Thomas Vance talk to me through 2 inches of wood and metal. "You shouldn't have left," he said, his voice almost gentle. "The house was perfect. I made it perfect for you. The temperature, the little adjustments, everything just right. I was taking care of you. You just didn't understand yet." A pause, and I heard something scrape against the door, metal on metal. He was trying to pick the lock. But that's okay. I'm patient. I've been patient for a long time. We can start over somewhere else, somewhere better, somewhere no one will interrupt us. The scraping sound continued, and I watched in horror as the deadbolt began to turn. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, the lock was giving way. I looked around frantically for something, anything I could use as a weapon. The lamp on the nightstand, the heavy glass ashtray on the desk, the letter opener in the hotel stationery kit. I grabbed the lamp and ripped the cord from the wall, holding it like a club, my whole body trembling. The deadbolt clicked open. The door swung inward, pushing against the desk I'd barricaded it with, and through the gap, I could see him. Thomas Vance, thin and pale, with eyes that reflected the hallway light, like an animal's. He smiled when he saw me, that patient smile of someone who'd been waiting a very long time for this moment. "There you are," he said softly, and pushed harder against the door. The desk scraped across the carpet, giving him another few inches. I raised the lamp and screamed, not words, just sound, as loud as I could make it, hoping someone on this floor would hear, would call security, would do something. Thomas flinched at the noise, but didn't stop pushing, and the gap was widening, almost wide enough for him to squeeze through. Then the elevator at the end of the hall dinged, and I heard footsteps, multiple footsteps running, and voices shouting, "Police! Don't move!" Thomas's head snapped toward the sound. For one frozen moment he looked back at me, and something passed across his face that might have been regret, or might have been rage. Then he bolted, shoving past the officers as they rounded the corner, and chaos erupted in the hallway, shouting, the sound of a struggle, a crash that shook the walls. I stayed in my corner, clutching the lamp, unable to move, until a female officer appeared in the doorway and told me it was over. They had him. He was in custody. I was safe. I didn't feel safe. I wasn't sure I ever would again. The trial took 8 months to reach a verdict, and I was there for every day of it. Thomas Vance was charged with stalking, breaking and entering, attempted kidnapping, and a list of other offenses that took the prosecutor nearly 10 minutes to read aloud during the arraignment. His public defender tried to argue diminished capacity, painting him as a mentally ill man who needed treatment rather than punishment, but the evidence was too overwhelming to spin. The photographs, the journals, the tools he'd used to carve spy holes into floors and walls. The list of names and addresses found in that basement, 7 women in total, all of whom he'd been watching at various points over the past decade. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before coming back with guilty on all counts, but it was what came out during the investigation that still keeps me awake at night. Detective Marsh had told me some of the previous tenants were difficult to locate, and I'd tried not to think about what that meant. During the trial, I learned the truth. Of the 6 women who'd lived in that house before me, 4 had been found and interviewed by police. They'd all experienced similar things, The feeling of being watched, small items going missing, the sense that someone had been in their homes while they were away. All of them had moved out suddenly, driven away by a fear they couldn't quite explain. The other two women were never found. Their names were Rebecca Thornton and Maria Santos. Rebecca had lived in the house for 3 months in 2019 before vanishing without notice. Her employer reported her missing when she stopped showing up for work, but the investigation went cold when police found no evidence of foul play. Maria had been there even earlier, in 2017, and her disappearance followed the same pattern. No body, no crime scene, no answers. Just 2 women who'd slept in the same bedroom I had, whose feet had dangled over the same darkness, and who were gone now without a trace. Thomas Vance never admitted to anything involving Rebecca or Maria. When prosecutors questioned him about the 2 missing women, he just smiled that patient smile and said nothing. His lawyer objected to the line of questioning as prejudicial, and the judge sustained it, and we never got any closer to understanding what had happened to them. But I saw the photographs in his basement. I read the journal entries about how watching eventually stopped being enough, about how he dreamed of something more permanent. I know what he was capable of, and I know I'm lucky to be alive. He got 32 years in federal prison. The judge called him a predator of the most insidious kind and recommended he never be considered for early release. I sat in the back of that courtroom when the sentence was read, and I watched Thomas Vance's face for any reaction. Shock, anger, despair, anything human. There was nothing. He just turned and looked at me, found my eyes in the crowd like he'd always known exactly where I was, and smiled. Then the bailiffs led him away, and I walked out into the sunlight and tried to convince myself it was finally over. It wasn't over. It's never really over, not completely. I moved to a different state after the trial, a city where no one knew my name or my story. I found an apartment on the top floor of a high-rise building. No basement, no crawl space, nothing but concrete and steel between me and the ground. I had the floors inspected before I signed the lease, paid a contractor to check every inch of the ceilings and walls for hollow spaces or access points. He probably thought I was crazy. I didn't care. I needed to know that no one could hide beneath me, that there was nowhere in my home for a monster to wait. I still check under the bed every night before I sleep. I know it's irrational. I'm on the 23rd floor. There's no space under my modern platform frame for anything larger than a dust bunny. But the ritual soothes something in me that logic can't reach. I get down on my hands and knees, shine my phone flashlight into the shadows, and confirm that I'm alone. Only then can I climb under the covers, and even then I sleep with the lights on more often than not. Brianna and I still talk, though the distance makes it harder. She was the one who got me through those first terrible months, who held me together when I was falling apart, and I'll never be able to repay her for that. She came to visit me last spring, and we spent a weekend pretending to be normal, shopping, eating at restaurants, watching movies like 2 friends without a care in the world. On the last night, she asked me if I was happy in my new life, and I didn't know how to answer. Happy felt like a word from a different language, one I used to speak fluently, but had somehow forgotten. I'm in therapy now, twice a week with a woman who specializes in trauma. She says I'm making progress, that the nightmares are coming less frequently, that my hypervigilance is slowly decreasing to manageable levels. She says healing isn't linear, that there will be setbacks and hard days, but that I'm moving in the right direction. I want to believe her. Most days I can almost convince myself that she's right, but I still feel his hand around my ankle sometimes, still wake up in the darkness with my heart pounding, certain that something is moving beneath me, that cold fingers are about to close around my skin and pull me down into the dark. I lie there frozen, just like I did that first night, waiting for something terrible to happen. And even when nothing does, even when the silence stretches on and the shadows stay still, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that somewhere, somehow, someone is looking at me through a hole I haven't found yet. I think about Rebecca and Maria more than I should. I think about who they were, what they dreamed about, whether they had people who loved them and missed them and never stopped looking. I think about how close I came to joining them, to becoming another name on a list that no one would ever fully understand. Some nights I feel guilty for surviving when they didn't. Other nights I just feel grateful, so overwhelmingly grateful that it makes me cry. 32 years. That's how long Thomas Vance will be in prison, assuming he serves his full sentence. I'll be in my 50s when he gets out. Older, hopefully wiser, hopefully healed in ways I can't imagine right now. Part of me hopes he dies in there, that I never have to think about him as a free man walking the same streets I walk. Part of me knows that even if he never gets out, the damage is already done. He's inside my head now, living in the dark corners where my sense of safety used to be, and I don't know how to evict him. But I'm trying. Every day, I'm trying. I sleep with the lights on now. I check under the bed every night. I flinch at sounds I can't identify, and I triple-check my locks, and I never, ever let my feet dangle over the edge of the mattress after dark. These aren't the habits of someone who's healed, but they're the habits of someone who's surviving, and for now, that's enough. So Thomas, if you're reading this in whatever cell they've put you in, I want you to know something. You took a lot from me. My sense of safety, my ability to trust, the simple pleasure of falling asleep without fear. But you didn't take everything. I'm still here. I'm still breathing. And every morning I wake up is another day you didn't win. I hope that thought keeps you company in the dark, the way you kept me company in mine.